Welcome to Verified Souls. Tonight we honor the memories of those lost to encounters with law enforcement and the shadows lurking behind the badge through true stories that will challenge everything you thought you knew about safety in Arizona's vast deserts, small towns, and highways. He used to joke that mile marker 237 was the loneliest piece of asphalt in Arizona. After that night, he stopped joking about the highway at all. It was just after 3 in the morning when the call came in, the kind of dead hour where the desert feels like it's holding its breath, and the only company you have is the glow of your dashboard and the occasional 18-wheeler roaring past in the opposite lane. The rookie, call him Ramirez, was on his last hour of a graveyard highway patrol shift east of Tucson, fighting off that heavy, slow blink that creeps in when the radio has been quiet too long. Dispatch broke the silence with a clipped, almost bored tone. Unit 14, possible vehicle rollover near mile marker 237. Caller disconnected, unknown injuries. The way she said possible told him she expected another false alarm. The way she sighed at the end told him this wasn't the first time she'd said those words for that exact mile marker. As Ramirez acknowledged and flipped on his lights, he thought he heard something in her voice. Fatigue with an edge of something else, something like dread. The night opened up in front of him in streaks of red and blue as he pushed up to 80. The highway a black ribbon between low dark hills. He'd heard the older guys mention 237 before, always in that half-joking, half-serious tone they used for the weird calls. The place where you get phantom brake checkers, the stretch that screws with your GPS, the mile marker where you just don't stop unless you have to. But he was new. New meant you didn't roll your eyes at calls. New meant you went, you checked, you wrote it up, and you didn't start buying into ghost stories on the side of the interstate. Even so, as the numbers on the markers ticked up, the hair along the back of his neck began to stand up, like he was walking into a room where someone had just been arguing and gone quiet. He saw it before he even got to the marker, the faint arc of old skid marks running from the lane onto the gravel shoulder, illuminated in the sweep of his headlights. No car, no fresh debris, just those dark streaks in the asphalt, and a simple wooden cross planted in the dirt a few yards off the road, its white paint flaked by too many summers. Flowers lay wilted at its base, plastic and real, bleached by the sun. Ramirez eased his cruiser onto the shoulder and stepped out, the weight of the body armor suddenly more noticeable in the cool desert air. Wind hissed through low brush, carrying the distant sound of a truck miles away. Otherwise, the world felt empty. He swept his flashlight across the scene, checked the ditch, glanced over the guardrail. Nothing. No overturned vehicle. No broken glass gleaming in his beam. No injured driver stumbling in the dark. He keyed his shoulder mic. Dispatch, 14 on scene at 2:37. Negative on any active accident. I've got old skid marks and what looks like an older memorial cross, but no vehicle, no debris. Continue to monitor the lines for a callback. There was a pause, a soft crackle. Copy 14, dispatch answered. Then, after a second, in a lower voice that wasn't meant to go over the air, of course. The channel clicked off, but the words stuck in his mind. Of course, like she'd expected nothing else. Ramirez frowned and walked toward the cross, his boots crunching gravel. The plaque nailed into it had a name and 2 dates, the younger one only a few years back. Beneath it, someone had taped a sun-faded photo of a smiling young man, maybe mid-20s, leaning against a pickup truck. The kind of picture you only take when you assume there's plenty of time left. As Ramirez stood there, the radio on his chest crackled again, louder this time, bursting into life with the sound of a man sobbing, not dispatch, not any officer he recognized. A raw, panicked voice, cutting in mid-sentence. Please, I'm upside down. I can't. There's glass everywhere. I can't feel my legs. Hello? Hello? The hairs on Ramirez's arms rose under his sleeves. The voice wasn't addressing him. It sounded like it was talking to someone else, some unseen operator, as if a call was bleeding into his frequency from somewhere it shouldn't. Dispatch cut through the overlap, her voice sharp. "Unit 14, you hearing that?" "Affirm," he said, eyes scanning the dark. "You patching me a 911 call?" "Negative," she replied. "There's nothing active on the board. I don't know what you're hearing." The man's voice broke into a scream for help that sounded like it was both in his radio and out in the night around him. It was a strange, disorienting effect, like sound echoing off glass inside his skull. "They keep driving by," the voice cried. "They don't see me. Please, somebody stop. My arm's pinned. I think I'm bleeding out. Oh God, I don't want to die out here." Ramirez spun in a slow circle, the beam of his flashlight slicing across scrub and sand and asphalt. The shoulder looked empty. No overturned car. No headlights in the ditch. But as his light passed over the skid marks, for a heartbeat, he saw something else in the reflective gleam. Just a suggestion of twisted metal, a wheel at a wrong angle, a cracked windshield, like his beam was moving over a scene that existed a fraction of a second in a different time. Then it was gone, replaced by bare gravel and tire streaks. He swallowed, suddenly aware of the taste of dust in his mouth. 14 to dispatch, he said, trying to keep his voice level. "Can you replay whatever audio just came through?" There was a longer pause this time. "Negative," she said slowly. "We don't have anything to replay. All I've got on my side is you asking about a patch." As she spoke, the man's voice continued in his ear, desperate, now mentioning a detail that made Ramirez's stomach drop. "He's out there," the caller sobbed. "I can see him. State trooper, tan uniform, hat on the ground. He's just standing there. Why isn't he coming over? Why won't he look at me?" Ramirez turned back toward the cross without meaning to. The engraved name on the plaque swam in his vision, suddenly connecting with something. A brief mention during academy training about a fatal rollover east of town. The instructor's offhand, "Scene was messy. Driver expired before units arrived." The rookie's pulse hammered in his ears, his own breath too loud inside his head. "Dispatch," he said quietly. "Can you run the name?" He read the name from the cross, the date of death. Another silence. When she came back on, the dispatcher's voice was different, softer. "Stand by." Ramirez heard keyboard clacking through the static. Then, "That's a closed-out 10-54 from 4 years ago. Single vehicle roll. Original caller was the driver himself. Line went dead mid-call. Units responded, found him deceased, on scene at mile marker 237. He stared at the cross, the picture of the young man smiling, frozen in that casual leaning pose. Behind him, his cruiser's dash camera recording light blinked steadily, unbothered by whatever was slipping through the channels. The voice in his earpiece started saying things that made his skin crawl. "He's just standing there, watching me," the caller choked. "He's got the same patch on his shoulder as the others, but he looks younger. He keeps checking his radio. Why won't he answer me?" Ramirez's free hand, without thinking, tugged his sleeve up a fraction, revealing the edge of the tattoo on his wrist, a small thing he'd gotten before joining the force. As he did, the caller's words overlapped, almost perfectly. "He's got a tattoo on his right wrist, little black lines. Please, please, I know you can see me." Ramirez froze. The desert seemed to press in around him, the air suddenly thin. 14, you okay?" Dispatch asked, sharper now. He realized his breathing had gone rough over the mic. "Yeah," he forced out, eyes burning. "Yeah, just checking the area one more time." He moved toward the guardrail and aimed his flashlight down into the dark beyond, expecting, on some irrational level, to finally see the wreck he felt like he was standing on top of. Instead, there was only empty space and rocks leading down to a dry wash. The voice in his ear grew weaker, fading like a radio losing reception. "Please," it whispered, "don't leave me here again." Then there was a sound like glass settling and a long, wet exhale, and silence. The radio went back to normal. Distant units checked in. Someone cleared a traffic stop 40 miles away. A bored night shift supervisor requested a status update. Ramirez stood very still beside the memorial cross, listening to his own heartbeat thunder in his chest. He wanted to call what he'd just heard a glitch. A bleed over from an old recording. Some weird artifact from a training simulation. But there had been no file, no patch, nothing on dispatch's end. And the caller had described him, standing there, right down to the details of his uniform and the ink hiding under his sleeve. He walked back to his cruiser, forcing his legs to move, and sat inside with the doors locked, the cabin suddenly feeling both like a refuge and a trap. The incident report he eventually submitted was dry and clipped. No vehicle located, area checked. No sign of accident or injured parties, likely false call. No mention of the voice. No mention of the name matching the cross. No mention of the sensation he couldn't shake. The feeling that, in some impossible way, he had been both responder and ghost, a bystander arriving at a scene 4 years too late, and yet somehow still being seen by the man dying in that unseen car. He didn't tell the whole story, not that night, not in the weeks that followed, even when he worked up the nerve to ask a veteran about 237 and got only a tight smile and a shrug. "We get weird reception out there," the older trooper said. "Don't let it get in your head. Mark the calls unfounded and move on." Unfounded. The word sat in his stomach like a stone. Months later, on a day off, Ramirez woke abruptly at 3:17 a.m. to his personal cell phone vibrating on the nightstand. The screen showed unknown number. Half asleep, he answered. On the other end, through a wash of static, a familiar broken voice asked very softly, "Are you going to leave me here again?" Then the line went dead. There was no missed call logged, no record in his phone. Just the glow of the screen and the feeling that, somewhere out on that dark stretch of highway, mile marker 237 was still replaying the same last few minutes, waiting for help that would never quite arrive. By the time the call came in about the house on Del Rio, he had already written it off as another noise complaint that would end in awkward apologies and someone in pajamas insisting they never called. It was just after midnight on the outskirts of Phoenix, in that forgotten fringe where the city ends in half-finished subdivisions and cul-de-sacs that planners gave up on. Officer Daniel Cole was sipping lukewarm coffee in his cruiser when dispatch cut in, her tone flat from too many hours on the headset. "Unit 24. Check a possible domestic disturbance. Fort Dern 19 East Del Rio Lane. Caller reports screaming, banging, possible female yelling for help. Caller refused to identify." He thumbed the mic, eyes on the GPS. 24 en route. As he pulled away from the corner store parking lot, the screen in his dash flickered for a second. When the map settled, Del Rio Lane appeared at the far edge of his patrol zone, a little bend of a street he didn't recognize. That alone wasn't weird. Phoenix was full of streets he hadn't been on yet, but the way the GPS hesitated, like it was dragging the data up from somewhere deep, made him glance at it twice. The neighborhood got quieter the farther he went. Streetlights thinned out, replaced by patches of darkness between pools of pale yellow. Houses went from fresh stucco to older, sagging ranch-style homes with boarded windows and weeds climbing the fences. The GPS directed him down Del Rio, a narrow dead end lined with 4 or 5 houses, each looking like time had given up halfway through. The address, 419, sat at the very end. He saw it in his headlights and felt, for reasons he couldn't name, an instinctive urge to slow down. The house was a single-story sun-bleached structure with plywood over 2 of the front windows and an overgrown yard choked with dry grass. A rusted swing sat at an angle near the front porch, one chain missing, seat tilted like someone had stepped off mid-swing and never returned. No lights glowed inside, no cars in the driveway. Yet as he rolled to a stop, He could have sworn he heard, faint under the hum of his engine, the muffled rhythm of something heavy striking a wall. Then a sound that froze him in place. A woman's voice, hoarse and panicked, screaming, "Stop, please!" Training took over. He was out of the car with his hand at his hip, radio clipped, voice close. "Dispatch 24. I'm on scene at 419 East Del Rio. I can hear what sounds like an active disturbance inside. Start me a second unit." He stepped up onto the cracked walkway, gravel crunching, eyes on the front door. As he reached the porch, the house went suddenly, utterly silent. The kind of silence you feel more than hear, like someone hitting pause on a movie mid-scene. He listened for the TV, music, anything, nothing. Just the faint buzz of a faulty streetlight behind him. He rapped on the door with his knuckles loud. "Phoenix PD, open the door." No answer. He waited, then knocked again, harder. "If someone's inside and needs help, call out." The only response was the dry rustle of weeds in the yard. He walked the perimeter, shining his flashlight through gaps in the boards. Inside, he saw what he expected in an abandoned house. Dust, overturned furniture, a couch with the stuffing gutted, old newspapers slumped in yellowed piles. But when his light passed over one of the front windows, not fully boarded, it stopped on something that nudged an unease he'd been keeping at bay. On a small table, just inside the glass, sat a half-full glass of water. No dust on the rim, no film on the surface. It looked like someone had poured it in the last hour and walked away. He frowned and tried the front door. It was locked, but the frame felt brittle, like one good shoulder check would give. He didn't want to break the door on a noise complaint, but the call had reported screaming, and he had heard it himself. He keyed his mic. "Dispatch, 24. I got no response at the door. The house appears possibly vacant from the outside, but I heard yelling on approach. Any previous history at this address?" The line went quiet longer than usual. When the dispatcher came back, something in her cadence had shifted. 24, be advised. 413. East Del Rio is flagged as condemned. Fire damage, structure unsafe. According to records, it's been unoccupied for 15 years. He blinked at the house, at the boarded windows, at the fresh-looking glass of water. "You sure on that?" he asked. "Affirmative," she said. Last listed occupant of record is a Melissa Hart, date of birth. She rattled off a date that put the woman near 40 now, if she was still alive. Note on file says, house fire, suspected homicide, suicide, no bodies recovered. The words hung in the night between him and the house. No bodies recovered, condemned, unoccupied. He swallowed and looked back at the glass of water, at the faint outline of something on the wall beyond it, like a darker patch of paint where a picture frame used to hang. His backup unit was 10 minutes out, 10 minutes that suddenly felt too long. He made a decision he would later question over and over, but in that moment, it felt simple. You hear someone screaming for help, you go in. 24 making entry, he said, then put his shoulder into the door. The wood gave with a crack, and a burst of stale air washed over him, hot and suffocating, carrying the faint scent of old smoke and something sweet beneath it. Inside, the beam of his light cut through dust motes, hanging in the air like they had been waiting. The living room was a shell, scorched patches on the ceiling, walls stained with smoke, furniture collapsed into ghostly shapes. In the center of the coffee table sat the glass of water, drops of condensation sliding down its side, leaving clear trails through the dust. A single set of footprints, small and bare, led from the front door through the grime toward the hallway. "Phoenix PD," he called again, voice muffled by the walls. "If you can hear me, call out." For a second, there was nothing. Then faint, from down the hallway, a woman sobbing. "He's coming back," she cried, voice breaking. "Please, please, he's coming back." Cole moved toward the sound, every muscle tight, his light tracing the hallway walls. Family photos still clung there, their glass cracked, Faces behind them faded but visible. A woman in her 30s with laughing eyes. A man with his arm too tight around her shoulders. A little girl with missing front teeth holding a stuffed rabbit. Ash stains climbed the corners of the ceiling. At the end of the hall, one door was closed, the wood slightly warped. The sobbing seemed to seep from behind it, along with a low, rhythmic thudding, like someone kicking weakly against something heavy. He pushed the door open slowly. The bedroom beyond didn't match the rest of the house. Here, the walls were mostly clean, the bed made with a floral comforter, a dresser neatly arranged with bottles of perfume and a hairbrush. The air felt warmer, like whatever fire had chewed through the rest of the house had somehow skipped this room. On the nightstand, an old digital alarm clock glowed 12:03 in dull red numbers, plodding forward 1 second at a time. On the bed, the outline of someone sitting with their back to him dented the covers, the fabric pulled tight over a shape that wasn't quite there. He saw the idea of a woman, shoulders shaking, hands pressed to her face. But when he focused his light, there was only the empty bed slowly bouncing in time with those imagined sobs. His breath came short. "Ma'am," he said, voice catching. "Melissa." The sobs hitched, like whoever he couldn't see had heard him. "He's coming back," the voice whispered right next to his ear, close enough that he felt the breath, though nothing moved the air. "You shouldn't be here when he comes back." His skin went cold. He spun, half expecting to see someone behind him, but the doorway was empty, the hall still and dead. His radio crackled, the sound making him jump. 24 status check, dispatch said. He realized he'd gone silent long enough to trip the timer. He brought the mic up with a hand that didn't feel like his. I'm inside, still checking. I thought I heard." He stopped, suddenly unable to find a version of the truth that didn't sound insane. His eye caught on a landline phone on the nightstand, the kind with a coiled cord. The receiver hung half off the cradle, dangling, swaying very slightly. He reached out and touched it. The plastic was warm, like someone had just been holding it. From the speaker came the faintest of sounds, the echo of a woman's voice screaming for help, layered with the distant, younger-sounding voice of a dispatcher giving calm instructions. For a second, he thought he was listening in on a current call. Then he heard his dispatcher's name, but her voice was different. Higher, less worn by years on the job. This call had happened long ago. He put the receiver gently back in place, his ears ringing. When backup arrived, they went through the motions with him. They cleared the house room by room, found no one. One of them, a sergeant who'd been around long enough to remember the original fire, gave him a searching look when he mentioned hearing a woman. "Sound travels weird in these old boxes," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "Maybe you caught an echo from outside. Kids, cats, whatever. Place has been empty since before you were out of middle school." In the living room, the glass of water now had a thin film of dust floating on the surface, as if it had been sitting untouched for years. The footprints in the hallway looked more like scuffs in ash than fresh prints. When Cole brought up the preserved bedroom, the others exchanged glances. "We had that room boarded for a while," the sergeant said finally. "Somebody must have pulled the boards. We'll get it resealed." His tone said he'd prefer if no mention of warm air or crying voices made it into any official log. Back at the station, Cole sat down to write his report. He stared at the blank box where he was supposed to describe what he heard and saw. In the end, the narrative was bland. Responded to reported domestic disturbance, forced entry due to perceived exigent circumstances. Interior of residence appeared vacant. Signs of previous fire damage. No persons located. No fresh disturbance observed. Cleared as unfounded. He didn't mention the phone. He didn't mention the breath on his ear. He didn't mention the way, as they were leaving, he'd caught a glimpse of one family photo that hadn't cracked. The one on the bedroom dresser that showed the woman from the hallway, picture standing at the front door, smiling. with a uniformed officer in the background who looked very much like him, even though the photo's date stamp was from the year he was born. He told himself it was pareidolia, faces and noise, echoes and pipes, stress and an overactive imagination, until the calls started coming again. Same time of night, same address, same reports from neighbors insisting they heard screaming from the boarded-up house. Newer officers responded, walked into the same stale air, came back pale and quiet. When Cole tried to pull his old report from the system to compare details, it wasn't there. The call history for 419 East Del Rio showed one entry, the original domestic disturbance from 15 years ago, coded as suspected murder-suicide. No bodies recovered, scene destroyed by fire. Every other line was gone, including his own. When he asked records, they shrugged. Probably a data migration error, someone said. Those old condemned properties fall through the cracks. He stopped asking. Months later, on another graveyard shift, the board lit up again. Multiple callers reporting screaming. 419 East Del Rio, dispatch said, voice a little too casual. Any unit in the area respond. Cole looked at the screen and saw Del Rio Lane blink into existence at the edge of the map, like the system had just remembered the street existed. He didn't key up, let someone else mark en route. As another unit took the call, he sat in the dark of his cruiser and stared at the address. In his mind, he saw the preserved bedroom, the clock blinking 12:03 over and over, the dent in the bed where someone sat crying, unheard. He thought about how some houses never really burn down, not where it counts. They just sit and wait, somewhere between paperwork and memory, playing the last few minutes of a bad night on a loop for anyone unlucky enough to listen. And in that moment, he knew that, no matter how many times they marked the calls as unfounded, someone on Del Rio was still calling for help from a fire that never finished, in a house the reports had already forgotten. He had been in that county for 3 weeks when someone finally warned him about the road. Not in briefing, not in any official capacity, just a quiet comment from a tribal officer in the parking lot as he was loading his cruiser at the start of night shift. If you hear voices on 64 near marker 12, the man had said, eyes on the horizon instead of on him, don't answer unless you can see the person talking. Then he walked away before the new deputy could laugh or ask what that was supposed to mean. Deputy Evan Blake chalked it up to local color. Rural Arizona was full of stories. Old mines you didn't go near, arroyos that flooded out of nowhere, roads the spirits didn't like. The academy hadn't covered dealing with that, so he filed it under, be polite, be professional, and let the old guys have their superstitions. By midnight, the station had settled into its own kind of quiet. The sheriff's office sat on the edge of town, low and stocky against the vast northern sky, its parking lot opening toward reservation land that began with a simple sign and stretched into the dark. Calls were slow. 1 DUI, a loose cow on someone's property line, a welfare check that turned out to be a drunk uncle snoring too loud. Blake was almost grateful when dispatch crackled with something other than boredom. County 3, unknown disturbance. Highway 64 near mile marker 12. Caller reports lights in the road. Possible stalled vehicle. No further. He grabbed the mic. County 3, copy. En route to 64 and 12. The night swallowed his headlights as he turned onto the highway, the town's few sodium lamps diminishing behind him until there was nothing but the white lines, the dark land stretching flat to the horizon, and above it a sky so full of stars it looked more solid than the ground. The mile markers ticked down, 15, 14, 13, each one a lonely reflective slash whipping past in his peripheral vision. Out here, the reservation boundary ran close to the road, no fence, no barrier, just a change in jurisdiction that everyone knew, but the land didn't acknowledge. His radio hummed softly with the occasional burst of chatter from other units in the county. No one else was near 64, The caller had been brief and panicked, according to dispatch. Lots of lights in the road, like police or something, and screaming over a radio, the dispatcher had read from the call notes. Call disconnected, unable to recontact. Blake's GPS showed his cruiser as a lone blue arrow in a sea of dark green nothing. He adjusted in his seat, told himself the tightness in his chest was just the caffeine wearing off. He saw the static before he heard it. The MDT screen on his dash flickered for a second, the map glitching into a mess of lines and blocks before returning to the highway view. At the same time, the radio gave a dry hiss that made him wince. It wasn't the usual crackle of weak reception. It felt like someone slowly grinding sand through the speaker. He tapped the radio, half a habit, half an excuse to do something with his hands. Dispatch, County 3. I'm about a mile out from 12. Getting some heavy static on my end. Are you copying? The reply came through, clear and crisp. Affirmative, County 3. You're 5 by 5 here. No other units reporting interference. He glanced at the radio, unsettled. The static had stopped the moment she spoke. But now, under her words, there had been something else. A faint, overlapping murmur, like another voice trying to talk at the same time, on a different frequency. He crested a slight rise and saw the green 12 marker flash past. The road ahead looked empty, the yellow line stretching straight into the dark. No stalled car, no hazards blinking. He slowed anyway, scanning the shoulders, beams sweeping over desert scrub and the hint of a shallow wash to his right. Dispatch, County 3. I'm at 64 and 12. Negative on any vehicles in the lanes or on the shoulder. I'll do a slow pass and check the ditches. He eased down to 30, leaned forward over the wheel out of long habit, searching for the telltale shimmer of glass or the outline of a bumper. That was when the radio snapped from silence into chaos. Unit 4, still northbound. Speed 85, a male voice shouted across his speaker, breathless and urgent. Suspect refusing to yield, left of center. We're coming up on mile marker 10. Another voice cut in, overlapping, shouting something about spikes, about box in, code words from a pursuit Blake was not in and had not been told about. He jerked his eyes to the radio display. The screen showed only his own unit number. No other cars were marked on his channel. Dispatch, confirm active pursuit on 64, he said, throat suddenly dry. There was a pause, then his dispatcher replied, calm and confused. Negative, County 3. No active pursuits on any county channels. Say again your traffic. The voices on his end did not stop. Tires squealed in his speaker. Sirens warbled at a pitch his own cruiser wasn't making. He pulled onto the shoulder and came to a full stop, putting the car in park. The night around him felt suddenly crowded, like the darkness had filled with things moving just outside the reach of his headlights. The radio continued to spill out a one-sided pursuit. He's crossing the center line, almost head-on with traffic. Brake, brake, going into the oncoming lane. Another voice screamed coordinates, call signs, a flood of information Blake couldn't anchor to anything real. Dispatch, I'm getting extended interference, he said, but his own voice sounded distant to his ears. I'm hearing what sounds like a pursuit on 64 from mile marker 15 down. Can you verify neighboring agencies? County 3, negative, she answered slower, as if choosing her words. No border agencies are in a chase in your area. You're clear from 10 miles in any direction. Are you sure you're... The radio cut her off with a sharp pop. Then nothing but the phantom chase. He sat there, engine idling, watching his own empty stretch of highway, while over his shoulder came the sounds of screeching brakes and a desperate officer yelling, he's not stopping, oh God. The crash, when it came, was so loud his speaker buzzed. Metal rending, glass exploding, a sickening low crunch that made his teeth ache. Someone screamed high and raw, then the line dissolved into what sounded like hot static, as if the air itself were burning. The smell of melted rubber touched his nose, but when he glanced in the mirror and out the windows, there was nothing. The desert was still. The road was bare. No light but his own. Then, very clearly, his own call sign came through the radio in a stranger's voice. "County 3, do you copy?" A new male voice, different from the others, spoke steadily, like he was standing a few feet away. "This is Unit." The number he used had been retired from the county roster before Blake joined. He recognized it from an old memorial plaque on the station wall. The hair on his arms rose. "County 3, this is 7 Adam 12, the voice said. "We have a 1050 major Highway 64, mile marker 12, requesting—" The last word warped, stretched, then snapped off as if someone had reached out and yanked the plug. He picked up the mic with fingers that weren't quite steady. "This is County 3, he said. "Identify your location." Silence pressed in. Then faintly, under a hiss of static, he heard something that didn't sound like radio at all. It sounded like breathing, strained and wet, and a man whispering, "We didn't see them until it was too late." Blake swallowed hard. The logical part of his brain marched through possibilities. Some old recording, glitching through the repeater. An overlapping frequency from a department 100 miles away. A prank. Anything that lived in the world of tech errors. The rest of him heard the way the voice had said his call sign, like they were connected in a way that had nothing to do with electronics. He stepped out of the cruiser, the desert night wrapping around him like a cold blanket. The stars were brutally bright, throwing a faint pale wash over the highway. He walked to the center line, boots crunching on grit, and just stood there, listening. No engines, no voices, but he smelled exhaust, sharp and brief, as if a car had just passed and vanished. For a heartbeat, the air around him changed. The temperature dropped. The hair at the back of his neck prickled, and he had the uncanny sensation of other cars blowing past him at high speed, the displacement of air against his uniform, the phantom glare of headlights in his peripheral vision. He flinched, stepping back instinctively, one hand outstretched as if to ward off an impact that never came. He sat in his unit until the static finally faded and the radio went back to normal dispatch traffic. By the time he returned to station, he'd half convinced himself it had been some kind of radio anomaly that would be explained by the techs in the morning. When he walked into the squad room, he found the older deputies clustered around the coffee pot, their conversation dying as he entered. One of them, a man with deeply lined eyes and a badge so worn it had molded to his shirt, looked him over once and said, 64 got chatty tonight. Blake hesitated. "I caught something weird around 12, he admitted. "Thought maybe it was a pursuit bleeding through." The old deputy nodded slowly. "Heard the voices?" he asked. "Guy calling for help from a crash that doesn't exist." Blake nodded before he could stop himself. They sat him down and pulled an old box of files from a cabinet that didn't usually get opened. At the top lay a yellowing report from 21 years ago. A high-speed pursuit on that same stretch of 64, a fleeing pickup crossing into oncoming traffic, a head-on collision that killed a family of 4 and an officer in the pursuing unit. The call sign listed for the deceased deputy matched the one Blake had heard on the radio. The final radio traffic transcript attached to the file was short. It ended mid-sentence, just like what had come through his speaker. "We never talk about it on the record," the older man said. "Too many jurisdictional fingers pointed, too many lawyers. The county buried it. But every so often, someone working nights out by 12 picks up their last run like it's happening again." Blake put in a ticket with the radio tech the next day. They tested his unit, checked the repeaters, ran diagnostics. "Everything's clean," the tech said. "No recorded anomalies. That frequency you said you heard the call on, it's not active, hasn't been in years." When Blake asked dispatch for the tapes from the previous night, the gap where the phantom pursuit should have been was filled only with his own calm request for verification and her replies. No overlapping voices, no crash, nothing. "You probably had the scanner on in the background," someone suggested, "or you nodded off and dreamed it with your eyes open." It would have been easy to accept, if not for one small detail. 2 nights later, he was back on 64, same shift, same dead hour. As he cruised past marker 12, doing the required 10 over like everyone else, his radio clicked on by itself, volume rising, without his hand on the knob. A quiet voice, barely more than breath, said his full name. Not his call sign, not County 3, but his name. Evan, it whispered. We didn't see them either. Next time, slow down. Then the radio went dead again. No one in dispatch had keyed up. No other units were on. He drove the rest of the night with his eyes glued to the edges of the beam, his headlights carved out of the darkness, half expecting taillights or a stalled car to appear out of nowhere. He never put any of that in a report. On paper, the only thing that happened near mile marker 12 that month was an unsubstantiated disturbance call, cleared with a few lines of bureaucratic language. But he learned, over time, that the road had its own reputation, shared in low voices over end-of-shift coffee. Sometimes you heard a crash that had already happened. Sometimes you heard one that hadn't. Either way, out on Reservation Road at 3 a.m., with static curling in your ears and old ghosts calling out coordinates, it stopped mattering whether it was stress or supernatural. What mattered was that somewhere, in some version of that night, an officer was still yelling into a radio no one could hear, begging for help at a mile marker every map said was quiet. And if you listened too long, you started to feel like you weren't just hearing the past. You were being invited to join it. By the time the voice showed up the second time, she had already memorized the pauses in the script. Dispatchers aren't supposed to admit that certain calls stick in their heads, but Angela could recite some of them word for word. She had been on the Phoenix graveyard desk for 11 years, long enough that the constant stream of panic and noise had become a kind of white sound she lived inside. There were rules about it. Stay calm, control your tone, keep your questions direct, log everything. You focus on the form, not the content. You do not take any of it home, but there are always exceptions. The first time she took the Delaney call, she had only been on nights for 6 months. It was burned into her like the afterimage of a bright light. That history wasn't in her mind at the start of this particular shift. It was a Tuesday night sliding toward Wednesday, the board quiet except for the usual drunks, alarms, and a hit and run that had already moved on to patrol and med. The room hummed with the low sound of other dispatchers on their own calls, the click of keyboards, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Angela sipped stale coffee and watched the CAD screen in front of her update. A unit cleared one call, another went en route to a suspicious person. She checked the clock. 2:11 a.m., the dead zone, when it's too late for bar fights, but too early for morning traffic. She almost started to relax. The line ringing in her ear sounded no different than the 100 before it. She hit the key, went into the script that had become second nature. 911, what is the address of your emergency? For a heartbeat. There was only a faint background noise, like a TV turned low. Then a woman's voice came through, ragged with breath and terror. He's back, the caller whispered. He's back. He's trying to get in. Angela straightened in her chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Ma'am, I need the address where this is happening, she said, tone steady. What's your address? The woman gave it in a rush, numbers and a street name. Angela typed it, watched the system auto-populate the rest. For a second, the address didn't mean anything. Then the red banner at the top of the screen flashed. Historical incident. Do not discuss with caller. A date popped up from 9 years ago. The memory hit her like cold water. The name attached to that old file was Delaney. The night 9 years ago when a woman had called twice in 20 minutes about an ex-boyfriend trying to break in. Officers were delayed by other higher priority calls. By the time they got there, the door was splintered, the house was full of smoke, and the woman and her 8-year-old son were dead. Officially, it had been ruled a murder-suicide, though the ex had vanished and was never found. The call had been Angela's. She had replayed that recording until supervision told her to stop. She had spent months mentally rewriting her own script. If she'd kept the woman on the line longer, if she'd called the sergeant sooner, if she'd said something different. Eventually, she was told gently but firmly to let it go. The file was sealed. The incident became another line in an internal review document. She never forgot the way the woman's voice had sounded, breath-hitching, whispering, "He's at the door, he's at the door," as wood cracked in the background. Now, on her headset, 9 years later, that same tone, that same pattern of breath. "He's at the door," the woman on the line whispered. "He found me. I locked it, but he keeps—" A hard bang echoed through the audio, making Angela flinch despite herself. Her fingers moved automatically. The address mapped, officers assigned. "Units 21 and 23, copy a possible home invasion in progress," she said into the radio. "Caller reports a known subject attempting to gain entry." She gave the address, heard 2 units click on in acknowledgement. Her other hand stayed on the call, anchored to the woman's voice. "Ma'am, listen to me," Angela said into the phone. "I have officers on the way." "Where are you in the house right now?" "The bedroom," the caller gasped. "I pushed the dresser, but he's hitting the door. My son is—" Another bang. Another sharp metallic rattle that sounded exactly like the one from 9 years ago, down to the hollow echo, the squeak of hinges. Angela's skin prickled. She glanced at the red historical banner again. It shouldn't be live. It was an old case, long closed. "Is there some place you can go? A bathroom you can lock? A closet?" Angela forced herself through the protocol, but the room felt like it had shifted around her, like she was sitting back in that same chair on that same awful night. The woman was crying now, breath coming in high, panicked sobs. "He's going to kill me," she said. "He said last time was a warning, but he's really going to do it this time." The word snagged. Last time. In the old transcript, she'd said something similar. He said the last time was a warning, right before the call cut off. Angela's heart thudded against her ribs. She pulled up the old audio file with quick key commands, something she was not supposed to do during an active call. The player window opened, tiny timeline bar ready to run. She muted the recording before it could blast into her ear, then watched the waveforms, peaks and valleys of sound. On the live call, the woman cried. Another bang hit the door. On the old file's waveform, the spikes matched, beat for beat. The hair on Angela's arm stood up. In her ear, the woman was begging now. "Please hurry. Please, I can hear the wood breaking." Angela glanced at the unit tracker. 21 and 23 were still 5 minutes out. Code 3, lights and sirens cutting across the map icons. "They're coming as fast as they can," Angela said, voice tighter than she wanted. "Can you tell me where your son is?" There was a pause on the line. In the original call, this was when the woman had said, "He's hiding in the closet. I told him not to come out no matter what." This time the woman said, "He's in the closet. I told him not to come out. He's so scared." Angela's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The script, the memory, the screen in front of her, they were all lining up in a way that made her stomach lurch. The rational part of her brain tried to take over. This could be a different woman. The address could have been reoccupied. Someone could have moved in, and the system screwed up as it always was, never updated properly. Except this house, this case, had been marked red permanently. She had been in the meeting when the chief said it would be condemned. The property file still showed it as vacant, slated for demolition that never happened. Dispatch wasn't supposed to send anyone there unless something huge forced their hand. And here she was, sending 2 patrol units into the shell of a house that, according to the computer, wasn't supposed to have a working phone line. A crackling sound bled into the call like wood splitting, like a chain breaking. The woman screamed. Angela flinched, her vision going white at the edges for a moment. In the old recording, this was the moment the line had gone dead. But now, it stayed live. She heard heavy footsteps, a door flying open, the hollow boom of it hitting a wall. A man's voice yelled something indistinct, a curse, angry, low. The woman sobbed, "No, please." Not in front of him. Angela's training called for gathering descriptions, weapons, clothing. She found herself unable to form the words. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "Melissa," into the headset, using the name from the old file. The caller went silent mid-sob. For a beat, all Angela heard was breathing, the woman's, the man's, overlapping. Then very quietly, the woman said, "You remember me?" The room around Angela faded. It was just her and that voice, floating on the thin wire between them. "We spoke before," the woman whispered. "You told me to stay on the line. You said they were almost here." Angela's throat closed. "They're almost there now," she said, and hated how uncertain she sounded. The unit tracker showed 21 and 23 turning onto the street, closing in. "You told me to hide my son," the woman continued. "You said the officers would get us out." In Angela's other ear, the old recording, muted but visible in the waveform, hit the point where she had said almost exactly those words 9 years ago. On that night, the call had cut to silence after a loud pop that investigators later matched to some unknown event in the house. No one had been there to tell Angela what actually happened in those last seconds. She had made up kinder endings in her head just to be able to sleep. Now, over a live line, she heard a small voice in the background, a boy whispering, "Mom." The man's voice snarled something, angry, then the sound of a struggle, bodies hitting something hard. The audio spiked. Angela's heart hammered as she watched the unit icons reach the address. 21, 23, you should be on scene, she said into the radio, fighting to keep her tone level. Caller reports active struggle inside the residence. Use caution. There was a burst of static. Then 21 came back, confusion in his voice. Dispatch, be advised, this structure looks abandoned. Boarded windows, no lights. We're not seeing any movement. Angela stared at the CAD notes. Caller is on an active line, reporting an intruder inside, she insisted. Front door. Doors. Already busted in, 23 answered. Looks like old damage. We're making entry. In her headset, the woman cried out again. He's got the gun, she said, panicked. Please, please. Something crashed, something shattered. The boy screamed. Angela clamped her hand over her mouth for a second, then forced it back to the keyboard. 21, I'm still hearing multiple subjects inside, she said. Can you confirm? Footsteps thudded in her ear, the officers' body cams feeding audio into the system, their breath loud as they cleared rooms that, according to them, were empty. Clear, 21 said. Living room clear, kitchen clear. This place is toasted, dispatch. Looks like fire damage from way back. There's nobody here. The caller's sobs grew distant, as if she were moving away from the phone. Angela wanted to scream at the units, to tell them they were wrong, that she could still hear it. Instead, she said, check the back bedroom. Last known location of the caller was a bedroom. In the background of the call, the man yelled something she couldn't make out. Then there was a single, deafening bang, like a gunshot right against the mic. The line went silent. At the same moment, the body cam audio from 21 and 23 glitched, hiccuped, then resumed with them stepping into a charred hallway at the back of the house. Bedrooms burned out, 21 reported. No furniture, no bed, nothing. Just ash. Angela stared at the call timer as it froze, then reset. The line showed as disconnected. She checked the history. The call log listed a duration of exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Same as the original Delaney call, down to the second. The system auto-attached the old incident number to it, as if it had recognized some matching pattern. When she tried to play back what she'd just heard, the recording errored out, claiming corrupted file. On the radio, 23 said, Dispatch, there's something you should see in here. His voice was quieter than before. On the wall. Looks like it didn't burn. She patched into their body cam feed on her monitor, something she did mostly for officer safety. The image was grainy in infrared, but she saw the beam of a flashlight steady on a patch of bedroom wall that, unlike the rest, was strangely clean. There, hanging crooked but intact, was a framed photo. A woman and a boy standing in front of the house, smiling, a man's arm around them, his face just out of frame. Angela recognized the woman immediately from the old file. The same eyes, the same set of the mouth. Under the glass, someone had written a date. It was the date of the original incident. "There's no other pictures in here," 23 murmured. "Just this one." Angela finished her shift. She wrote the call up as a duplicate of the historical incident, noting that responding units found no signs of current occupancy, no active disturbance. By sunrise, the audio file from that night had disappeared from the system archives. IT shrugged, blamed server issues. The only trace left was a line in the log linking it back to the 9-year-old homicide-suicide everyone had agreed not to talk about anymore. She went home, lay in bed, and stared at the ceiling until her eyes burned. The next week, on another dead Tuesday night, another call came in at 2:11 a.m. Same address, same red banner. This time, the line opened with a simple sentence spoken in a calm, tired voice. "You did what you could," the woman said. No screaming, no banging, just quiet. Angela's hand shook as she lifted the headset closer. "Who is this?" she asked, though she already knew. "You kept me on the line," the caller said. "You stayed until the end. I just wanted you to know that." The background noise sounded like the hiss of a gas stove, the crackle of something beginning to burn. "They always say to let it go," the woman continued, "but some of us can't. Some of us are still in that room, waiting." The line crackled, then dropped to dead tone. When Angela pulled the call from the log, seconds later, it was gone. No entry, no record. As if it had never come in. She sat there in the half-lit dispatch room, the hum of other people's emergencies washing over her, and realized there were calls that would never show on a report, incidents that lived only in the spaces between the official lines. From then on, whenever a young dispatcher asked her what the hardest part of the job was, she didn't say the hours, or the stress, or the anger. She thought about the Delaney address, the red banner, the way old waveforms had matched new terror down to the second, and she answered carefully, "It's the calls you can't disconnect from, the ones that don't stay in the past, no matter what the system says." By his fourth summer on nights, the calls all started to blur together for Deputy Mark Ellison. Same two-bar dive, same guys with the same grudges, same sticky parking lot lit by a buzzing neon beer sign. The town was barely a dot on the Arizona map, a strip of gas stations and trailers south of Tucson that the highway mostly ignored. Mark liked it that way. After 10 years in a bigger department, he'd taken the job out here for the quiet, for the illusion that things were simpler, where everybody knew everybody. He knew exactly how many domestic calls he'd handled in that bar's parking lot, exactly how many fights he'd broken up between the Ruiz brothers, exactly which nights the old jukebox would stick on the same George Strait song. Routine was comforting. It meant you'd seen it before, and you'd see it again. Until the night routine started to repeat in ways that didn't make sense. It was just past midnight when dispatch called in the disturbance at the Dusty Spur. "County 12, noise complaint, possible fight outside the spur again," the dispatcher said, unsurprised. "Caller reports 2 males yelling. Sounds like it might get physical." Mark thumbed the mic. "County 12, I'm right around the corner. I'll check it out." He could have driven there blind. The road from the tiny substation to the bar was muscle memory by now. As he turned off the main drag, he saw the usual, a scattering of pickup trucks, a couple of Harleys, the neon sign flickering. Out front, 2 men squared off in the gravel, hands thrown wide, voices elevated but not yet punching. Carlos and Benny Ruiz. Of course. Mark parked, stepped out, and walked over with the weary authority of someone who'd refereed this exact fight a dozen times. "All right, that's enough," he said, voice carrying. "You two want to sleep it off in the tank again, or you want to go home?" They both turned, faces flushed with booze and heat, caught in the act like kids. Benny muttered something about family business. Carlos, always the more talkative, launched into a drunken explanation about a card game, about money, about old resentments. Mark let them vent for a minute, then separated them, putting a firm hand on each chest and nudging them toward their trucks. "No blood, no broken glass. I'm not writing this up tonight," he said. "You go left, you go right, and if I hear your names again before sunrise, we're doing paperwork." They grumbled, but they went. He watched their taillights split in opposite directions down the highway, then took a deep breath of the warm desert air and felt that small flicker of satisfaction that came from diffusing something before it got ugly. The next night, the call came in at almost the exact same time. "County 12, disturbance at the Dusty Spur," dispatch said, tone edging toward amused. "Caller reports 2 males arguing, possible fight. Sounds like the Ruiz brothers again." Mark glanced at the clock on his dash, 12:07 a.m. He shook his head, half smiling. "County 12 en route," he replied. When he pulled up, he saw the same scene. Same trucks, same neon, same 2 silhouettes squared off in the same patch of gravel. For a moment, he thought they were literally replaying last night's argument, like 2 bad actors stuck on a script. "You two ever get tired of this?" he called as he approached. Carlos turned, eyes bloodshot, and said, "He cheated me, man. He always cheats me." The words hit Mark's ears with a déjà vu that felt heavier than it should have. The beats played out almost identically. Benny shoved Carlos. Carlos swung. Mark stepped between them, used his most authoritative, cut-it-out voice. He separated them, sent them on their way. As he drove back to the substation, the feeling nagged at him. He pulled up his previous night's call log, read his own bland narrative. Verbal dispute between brothers, no physical altercation observed, both parties separated, no report taken. He wondered if he'd just started writing up every night the same way, if boredom had flattened his memory. He let it go. Bars breed patterns, brothers fight. It was nothing supernatural, just small-town life on repeat. The third night, when dispatch called the Dusty Spur at 12:07 a.m. on the dot, her tone wasn't amused anymore. "County 12, same caller, same complaint," she said. "They're saying it sounds like a recording out there. Same words." That phrasing made something in his chest tighten. He rolled up to the bar and saw the same trucks, parked the same way, under the same flickering sign. He stopped a little farther back this time and watched for a second before getting out. Carlos and Benny squared off just as before, but now Mark paid attention to the exact sequence. "You always do this," Carlos yelled. "You always cheat me." Benny shoved his shoulder, said, "You're just sore because you lost." Carlos swung and missed. Mark felt a cold sensation travel down his spine as he realized he could mouth each line along with them, like he was watching a rerun. He stepped out and intervened anyway, because what else could he do? They reacted to him with the usual mix of irritation and begrudging respect. He tried to break the script. "Look, we're not doing this every night," he told them. "I'm tired. You're drunk. Go home." Carlos, instead of arguing details about the game like he had before, just stared at him for a second. His pupils, blown wide in the parking lot's dim light, made his gaze look almost empty. "You said that before," he mumbled. "You said that yesterday." Benny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's just because you're always here," he told Carlos. "It's like you live in this lot." The hair on the back of Mark's neck rose. He wanted to write it off as a booze-addled comment, but back in his cruiser, he checked the time. 12:17 a.m. The past 3 calls had all closed out at exactly that minute. He started tracking it. Night after night, the board lit up at 12:07 a.m. with a call from the same anonymous number, often someone at the bar using the owner's phone, claiming they'd heard yelling outside. The narrative didn't change. 2 males. Sounds like they're about to fight. Same phrases, same cadence. On the 5th night, Mark decided to get ahead of it. He parked around the corner at 11:55, lights off, and watched the lot. At 12:03, he saw the brothers walk out. At 12:05, he saw them start arguing. At 12:07, his radio chirped with the call, as if the universe was reading the script along with them. This time, he stepped in earlier, before the shove, before the swing. "Hey," he said, inserting himself into their space. "Not tonight. Get in your trucks and go." Carlos looked at him, brow furrowed like someone had skipped a line. "We haven't even—" he started, then stopped, confused. Benny rubbed his face, blinking as if he'd just woken up. The temperature of the moment shifted. For a second, it looked like he'd actually broken the pattern. They each trudged to their trucks. Engines started. The parking lot emptied. Mark drove a loop around town to burn off the adrenaline. 10 minutes later, dispatch pinged him. "County 12, we just got another disturbance call at the Dusty Spur," she said, voice tight. "Caller reports 2 males fighting in the parking lot. Didn't leave a name." He stared at the radio. "I was just there," he said. "There's no one—" "Do you want me to cancel the call?" she asked. He thought about it. Thought about the way the brothers' faces had gone slack with confusion when he cut the scene short. "No," he said finally. "Mark me en route." When he pulled in, the lot was empty. No trucks, no bikes, no patrons. Just the neon sign flickering over a circle of disturbed gravel, scuffed in the shape of shoes pivoting, bodies turning, like a ghostly imprint of a fight that had already happened. He stepped out and listened. For a moment, the night held its breath. Then faintly, as if from a radio clipped to an invisible vest, he heard his own voice say, "All right, that's enough, you two," echoing his words from earlier nights. It came from the center of the lot, from nowhere. He turned sharply, one hand on his flashlight, but there was no one there. The sound faded like a tape running out. He checked his own radio. It was silent. Dispatch hadn't transmitted. Back in his unit, he called in an equipment check. Nothing was wrong, according to the tech the next day. No recorded loop. No cross-channel interference. Just his imagination, they suggested, or the way sound carries in an open lot. When he mentioned the repeating calls to his sergeant, the older man got very quiet. "We had a bad one there, years back, before your time," he said. "Brothers got into it. One pulled a knife, stuck his own blood in the neck, bled out on the gravel. There were 3 calls about it before it happened, and one after, all same caller. Same timestamp. Dispatch logged the first as a possible verbal, second as a hung-up line. They didn't get us there in time." He looked down into his coffee. "That lot stuck on that night, far as I'm concerned. Some fights don't end when you zip the bag." On paper, the incident had been marked closed. The survivor did a short stint in prison, got out and moved away. The bar washed the blood off the gravel, replaced the stained dirt. Life went on. But as the weeks ticked by, the 12:07 call kept coming. It didn't seem to matter if Carlos and Benny were actually there. Sometimes they were home, asleep, nowhere near the bar, and Mark knew that because he'd just driven past their trailers. Still, someone, or something, would report 2 men yelling in the parking lot. When Mark responded, he'd find fresh scuffs in the dirt and an empty space that felt recently occupied. One night, he brought the bar owner out with him and asked if the man had called. The owner shook his head, pale. "I don't pick up that phone after midnight anymore," he said, nodding toward the landline behind the bar. "Sometimes it rings by itself." It escalated the night he tried not answering the call. He was miles away, dealing with a stranded motorist, when dispatch repeated the Dusty Spur disturbance 3 times, voice getting sharper. "County 12, are you clear for that?" she asked. He hesitated, looked at the time, and felt stubbornness rise. "Negative, I'm tied up," he said. "Can you send 14? 14 was off duty. There was no one else. They marked the call pending and let it sit. As he finished helping the stranded driver, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. For a second, it looked like blue and red light flashes bouncing off the side of his unit. He turned, expecting another cruiser. The road behind him was empty. No headlights. No vehicles. The light vanished. The hairs on his arm stood up. When he finally headed back toward town, he passed the road to the dusty spur. Even from the highway, he could see the faint, grainy glow of the neon sign. As he drew parallel, his radio kicked on by itself. A voice he recognized as his own, but younger, said, "Dispatch, County 12 on scene, 2 males fighting. Send me backup." The timestamp on the radio display glitched to a date from 6 years earlier, then snapped back to the present. He slowed, heart hammering. The board in dispatch showed the original 1207 call as, "No units available, call cleared." He realized, with a sick twist of understanding, that something out there was trying to drag him back to complete a script that had once ended in blood. He went to the bar anyway. It felt worse not to. The lot was empty. Only the wind moving dust around. He walked to the center of the gravel, stood where the scuffs were always worst, and just listened. The air felt thick, like humidity before a storm, but the sky was clear. In the far distance, a train horn moaned. Closer, he heard the faintest hint of argument, like voices bleeding through a wall. Cheated me. Always cheat. It wasn't Carlos or Benny. It was other men, from another time, trapped in a loop that had nothing to do with the living brothers, who now unknowingly echoed them. Mark started writing the calls up differently after that. He still put verbal disturbance, no parties on scene where the form required it. But in the narrative, on the lines no one but another cop would ever read, he added a note. This is the 3rd, 5th, 10th call at this time, same location. No subjects located. Physical evidence suggests repeated altercation in same area. It was his way of acknowledging what everyone else was content to shrug off as glitches. On his nights off, lying awake in his trailer, he'd hear the distant thump of bass from the bar, the occasional roar of laughter, and, sometimes just after midnight, a faint echo of shouting that didn't quite match the night's crowd. The rookie they hired later that year asked him once why the dusty spur had such a thick stack of incident printouts. Mark thought about telling him everything, the perfect timing, the matching lines, the way his own voice had ghosted through the radio. Instead, he said, "Some places just attract trouble." Then, after a pause, he added, "If you get a call there at 12:07, go, even if patrol is slammed, even if you've been 3 times already that week. Just go." The rookie frowned, not understanding. Someday, maybe, he would. Because in that little desert town, the worst night in the Dusty Spurs parking lot hadn't ended when they zipped up the bag and hosed down the gravel. It had just kept playing after closing time, waiting every night for someone in uniform to show up and try once again to break a fight that already ended badly years ago. The prisoner was already loaded when they brought the van around to the Sally Port, sitting on the rear bench with his wrists cuffed to the chain that ran along the metal rail. It was a routine late-night transport from a small county jail outside Tucson up to a bigger facility closer to Phoenix. 2 hours of highway, paperwork at the other end, and then home before sunrise, if everything went smooth. Sergeant Paul Hargrove had done this run so many times, he could have drawn the route with his eyes closed. He liked these shifts, if he was honest. No calls, no chaos, just asphalt and static, and a partner he trusted watching the mirrors while he watched the road. This time his partner was Morales, 5 years on, squared away, still young enough to believe procedure could keep the real ugliness at bay. The prisoner was listed on the manifest as David Locke, 42, assault, prior violent history, no known mental health diagnosis. There was nothing in the file that hinted at anything supernatural. If there had been, it wouldn't have made it into the paperwork anyway. The jailer walked them through the checklist at the back doors, ticking items off with a tired pen. Restraints double-locked. waist chain secure, ankles shackled. Hargrove signed his name at the bottom of the form without really looking at it. His signature had become a muscle reflex. He glanced at Locke through the grate, medium build, close cropped hair, jail blues hanging loose on a frame that looked like it used to be thicker. His eyes were what stuck out. Too calm. Not the glazed aggression Hargrove was used to seeing on guys going upstate. Not the hopped-up paranoia of someone withdrawing. Just a steady, interested kind of watchfulness, like he was the one checking them off on a list. They pulled out of the lot at 1:13 a.m. The city lights thinned behind them, replaced by the dark open stretch of desert that lay between the southern outskirts and the long sprawl leading into Phoenix. Hargrove drove. Morales rode shotgun, MDT glowing in front of him, radio clipped to his shoulder. Behind the steel and reinforced plastic, Locke sat upright on the bench, hands in his lap as far as the cuffs allowed. For the first 20 minutes, it was exactly the kind of ride Hargrove expected. The rhythmic hum of tires, the soft crackle of radio traffic, Morales making half-serious jokes about stopping for coffee they weren't allowed to buy on duty. They were about 10 miles past the last real cluster of lights when the prisoner spoke up for the first time. "You still keep pictures in your visor, Sarge?" he asked, voice mild. There was no way he should have known the rank. Neither of them had said it out loud in the van, and from the rear bench, his angle on the front seats was limited. Hargrove glanced at the rearview mirror. Locke wasn't looking at him. He was looking slightly down, as if talking to someone sitting next to him. "Don't talk to the inmate," Morales said automatically, not unkind. "Face forward." Locke smiled, just a corner of the mouth. "You took the picture down after the argument," he said. "But you still tuck it up there when you're alone on nights. You just push it back up quick if anyone opens the passenger door." The back of Hargrove's neck prickled. The photo he kept clipped behind the visor was of his daughter, age 10, in her soccer uniform. He had taken it down a month ago after an ugly blow-up with his ex over how much he was gone. No one at work knew about the fight. No one had seen the picture since. He told himself it was a lucky guess. Lots of cops kept family photos there. He kept his eyes on the road. "Policy says no unauthorized conversation with prisoners in transport," he said. "Save your breath." Locke chuckled softly. "Sure," he said. "But you know how it goes. Policy on paper, and then what actually happens at 3 in the morning on the 10, halfway between nothing and nowhere." The van's headlights carved out a tunnel in the dark. The GPS showed their little icon, sliding steady along the interstate. Morales shifted in his seat, giving Hargrove a sideways look that said, "You hearing this too?" Hargrove shrugged tight. They rode in silence for another mile. Then Locke spoke again. "This is the part where you check your phone even though you know you shouldn't," he said, conversational. "You don't read the message. You just stare at her name and wonder if she's awake. You rehearse what you'd say if you called." There was no way he should have known there had been a message. Hargrove had felt his phone buzz in his vest pocket right as they pulled onto the highway, ignored it, and then spent 10 minutes trying not to think about it. He hadn't touched the device. He hadn't glanced at the screen. They had been in the open sally port, every move on camera. The prisoner had never seen his hands. Morales twisted in his seat, peering through the grate. "Hey," he said. Sharper now. "How the hell do you know anything about his phone?" Locke tilted his head, considering him. "You're the talker," he said to Morales. "You fill the silence with whatever you can think of, so you don't end up alone with your thoughts. You're thinking right now that this is some kind of setup, maybe an informant who got a briefing about you two before the ride. You're wondering what you did, what they told me." His tone stayed friendly, but the words landed like taps on a bruise. Morales flushed, half angry, half unsettled. "I don't care what they told you," he said. "You're doing your 2 hours, and then you're someone else's problem." A lull in the radio coincided with a small dead patch in their cell coverage. The MDT flashed, signal lost for a second before reconnecting. It happened all the time out here. It still felt worse now, like something had briefly unplugged them from the grid. Locke leaned his head back against the partition, chains rattling softly. "You ever think about the ones you hurt that never made it onto paper?" he asked suddenly. "The ones who didn't file a complaint because what would be the point?" Hargrove's hands tightened on the wheel. Every cop with years on had at least one call that kept them up. A punch thrown too hard, a shove that went wrong, a moment where anger and fear made them go a little too far. His was a suspect in an alley, drunk and mouthing off, who ended up on the ground with a broken orbital and a story the report did not quite match. It had been smoothed over by a sympathetic supervisor, chalked up to suspect resisted, necessary force used. There had been no body cam then, only words. "You don't know anything about my calls," Hargrove said quietly. "Stop talking." Locke laughed, and this time there was something like pity in it. "Patterson," he said. His name was Patterson. "You still remember the way his head bounced when it hit the bricks, don't you?" The image hit so hard, Hargrove had to force himself not to swerve. He hadn't heard that name in 6 years. The man had died of an overdose a year after the arrest. Hargrove had read the obituary, felt a small, sour twist of guilt, and buried it. He had never said the name out loud since. Morales looked between them. "Sarge," he said very softly. The radio exploded to life, making them both jump. Static, then a half-garbled call about a domestic back in the city they'd just left. Dispatch's voice sounded too bright, like it belonged to a different world. Hargrove answered automatically, letting her know they were out of county and unavailable, his voice sounding normal to his own ears. When he signed off, the van seemed to close in again. The hum of the tires grew louder. Locke shifted on the bench, chains clinking. "You know the weird thing about these rides," he said. "It's like a vein between two hearts, pumping blood from one to the other. Everything you think you're leaving behind leaks in here with you." Morales, trying to shake off the eerie specificity of what Locke had said, went back to the safer terrain of procedural suspicion. "So, who briefed you?" he demanded. "You working off something for internal. Did they tell you to rattle us? That's not how any of this works, man." Locke smiled wider, teeth catching the dashboard glow for a second. "You call it rattling," he said. "I call it recognition." He leaned forward as far as the chain would allow, his voice dropping. "Do you want to talk about the dog or the girl first?" Morales froze. Hargrove glanced at him, confusion momentarily overtaking his own dread. Morales stared straight ahead, knuckles white on his knees. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said too quickly. "Sure you do," Locke said gently. "The dog that bolted across the frontage road on your rookie year. You hit it at 40, felt the thump. You looked in the mirror and saw it spinning on the asphalt, back broken, trying to drag itself to the median. You told yourself it was just an animal. You didn't turn around." Morales' mouth opened and closed. Hargrove remembered dimly a story in the break room from years ago, Morales laughing it off, saying, "Man, I didn't even see it or just heard the bump." That had been the joke version. The way Locke described it was the private version, the one you don't put spin on when you're alone. "And the girl," Locke continued, "that one you never talked about to anyone, the one at the party you broke up before you transferred down here. She was sitting on the curb, mascara all over, saying she didn't want to go home. You put her in the car, drove her back anyway, left her with a father whose eyes you couldn't quite meet. You knew what he was when he opened the door." Morales' throat worked. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness ahead, but it was clear he was seeing something else entirely. "Shut up," he said, voice scraping. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're spitballing generic guilt, that's all." The van's interior temperature seemed to drop a couple degrees. The AC was set low, but this was different. Hargrove felt a shiver crawl up his spine despite the humid air outside. He checked his mirrors. The highway behind them was empty. No headlights, no taillights, just black. "How many partners have you had on this run?" Locke asked, almost casually. 3, 4. Hargrove didn't answer. You ever notice it feels the same every time? Locke went on. Same conversations, same jokes, same quiet spots on the radio, like you're riding along a groove that's been worn into the night. Hargrove remembered suddenly another transport years back with a different prisoner who tried to get into his head. A lot of them did. This felt different. This felt like someone reading from a file that didn't exist anywhere but in his own chest. He forced himself to speak. You're making a lot of assumptions, he said. We don't know you. You don't know us. So unless you want extra charges for trying to intimidate officers, you're going to sit back and keep that mouth shut the rest of the way. It was a weak threat, and everyone in the van knew it. There was nothing in the codebook about a prisoner being too perceptive. Locke sighed, almost theatrically. You're right, he said. We don't know each other. Not in this version. He let that hang for a second. Last time, you pulled over just before the rest stop up ahead. Tire light came on. You got out to check. Your partner stayed in the car. Things went badly. Morales shot Hargrove a look. We've never transported this guy before, right? He asked. Right, Hargrove said. His mouth felt dry. The tire pressure monitor had just pinged amber on the dash. He realized he'd been subconsciously compensating for a slight pull in the wheel for the last mile. He glanced at the gauge cluster. One rear tire pressure was dropping. Not alarmingly yet, but enough to register. Goosebumps lifted on his arms. Probably a slow leak, Morales said quickly, seeing his eyes. We can make it to the rest area. You could, Locke agreed. You didn't. You pulled over on the shoulder, right about here. As he spoke, the rest area sign flashed past on the right, its reflective surface flaring in their high beams. It should have reassured Hargrove. Instead, it hit like a bad omen. His training argued with his gut. A tire issue at highway speed can get you killed. You pull over, you deal with it. That was the rational track. The irrational part whispered that whatever groove this night was in, Locke knew it too well. We're taking the exit, Hargrove said abruptly, guiding the van onto the ramp for the rest area instead of stopping on the shoulder, like he might have otherwise. Morales looked relieved. In the mirror, Locke smiled faintly. There you go, he said. Small changes. They rolled into the mostly empty rest stop, sodium lights casting a sickly glow over concrete benches and vending machines. Hargrove parked in a well-lit spot, camera catching every angle. He killed the engine, but left the electrics on. The tire pressure reading blinked, then steadied. I'll take a look, Morales offered, clearly wanting any excuse to step out of the van, away from their passenger. Hargrove nodded. As his partner circled the vehicle with a flashlight, Hargrove remained in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel. The prisoner shifted, chained scraping the bench. This is about where I went for your gun last time, Locke said conversationally. You were standing right there. He jerked his chin toward the driver's door. Door open, 1 foot on the gravel, thinking about whether to call ahead, and warn intake you were bringing in a problem. It's funny what sticks. The smell of hot rubber. The sound your head made when it hit the frame. Hargrove swallowed, throat tight. There is no last time, he said through his teeth. You've never seen me before tonight. Locke tilted his head, studying him. In the glare from the rest stop lights, his pupils looked almost black. You ever flip through the same case file so many times it feels like the pages are going to wear through, he asked. That's what nights like this are. The system runs them until the edges fray. Sometimes it tries a different ending. That's what you're doing right now. Morales climbed back in, reporting that the tire looked fine. Maybe the sensor was acting up. They pulled back onto the highway, both of them quieter than before. For the rest of the drive, Locke said very little. When he did speak, it was small, precise comments that made both men simultaneously want to argue and stay silent. A mention of the exact brand of cologne Hargrove used only on court days. A reference to the way Morales always touched the rosary he kept secret in his pocket when the radio announced an officer needs help call. None of it was explosive. All of it was somehow worse than threats. By the time the lights of the receiving facility appeared ahead, like a washed-out oasis, both men's nerves felt raw. They checked lock-in without incident. Intake officers signed the chain of custody. The prisoner shuffled through the doors without looking back. It would have been easy to pretend the whole ride had been a mind game, a manipulative con by a man with a talent for reading people. Easy, except for one thing. As they finished their paperwork, a clerk in the intake office frowned at the screen. "Huh," he said. "That's weird." Hargrove's stomach tightened. "What?" The clerk turned the monitor slightly. "It's showing him as booked an hour ago by..." He squinted. "Sergeant Hargrove and Officer Morales. That's you guys, right? System must have double-entered something." On the way back, the van felt even emptier than it had going up. Morales finally broke the silence. "What if he was just some guy who saw our names on something?" he said, trying to structure a rational explanation. "And the intake glitch is just that, a glitch." Hargrove kept his eyes on the dark road ahead, the tire pressure readings steady now, as if they'd never dipped. "Then it's one hell of a coincidence," he said. He didn't mention that when he'd flipped his visor down at a red light on the outskirts of Phoenix, the photo of his daughter had been sitting perfectly centered there, even though he distinctly remembered leaving it in a drawer at home. He never filed a report about anything unusual on that transport. The official documentation read smooth and uneventful. But when rookies rode with him on similar late-night runs, he found himself repeating a piece of advice he'd never been given. "Whatever you're carrying," he'd say, eyes on the dark line of highway ahead, "don't bring it into the van." Because sometimes it talks back. He never mentioned Locke by name. He didn't have to. Somewhere between the jail and the prison, on that stretch of desert asphalt, where radios go quiet and the rest of the world falls away, every secret a cop thinks is safely buried feels a little closer to the surface. And once in a while, something in the back of the transport smiles, like it recognizes you from another version of the same long, bad ride. By the time anyone took the calls about the lights seriously, the wash had already collected more than water. In that city, the wash was just part of the landscape, a wide concrete channel that only mattered a few weeks a year when the monsoon storms turned it into a brown, furious river. The rest of the time, it was a forgotten scar running under overpasses and behind strip malls, a place teenagers went to smoke, tag walls, and pretend they weren't one bad decision away from a flood video on the evening news. Crime scene techs like Leah knew it in a different way. Bodies rolled downhill. Guns, knives, stolen wallets. They all seemed to find their way into channels like this, where gravity and apathy met. Leah had been working scenes in that Arizona city long enough that she could tell, from the first look, whether something bad had happened in a place before. The wash had that feel even when it was empty, especially when it was empty. On her days riding along with patrol, she liked to look at the in-between places, the spaces under the roads that most people forgot about. She never mentioned that habit in her evaluations. Curiosity wasn't always rewarded in her line of work. It was that same curiosity that made her pay attention when the first call about kids with flashlights in the wash came across the radio. It was just after 10 on a Tuesday, one of those heavy nights where the clouds sat low and reflected the city's light back down, turning the sky into a dull orange lid. Leah was in the passenger seat of a patrol car shadowing Officer Clay for the shift to get a better sense of how scenes looked before the tape went up. They were inching through traffic near an overpass when dispatch's voice cut through the chatter. "Unit 32, caller reports multiple juveniles down in the wash near 19th and McDowell, shining flashlights and making some kind of shapes. Unknown what they're doing. Complainant says it looks like some ritual." Clay rolled his eyes. "Probably TikTok idiots," he muttered, but he hit the lights and took the next turn toward the access road. They pulled into the small dirt lot by the chain-link fence and killed the siren. From up on the bridge, cars hissed past in a steady stream. Down below, the wash stretched out in two directions. Concrete bed dry, graffiti tagging the walls in layers. Leah leaned on the rail and scanned the shadows. Nothing. No kids, no lights. Just a stray grocery cart tipped on its side and a plastic chair half embedded in the sloped wall. Clay hopped the fence, boots scraping, and slid down onto the wash floor, flashlight beam cutting along the edges. Leah stayed up top, watching his white circle of light move. "Dispatch, 32 is on scene," he said into his radio. "Negative contact. We'll check up and down a bit." As he walked, Leah squinted at the darker center of the wash. For a second, she thought she saw something. Small points of light scattered across the concrete like someone had dropped a handful of glow sticks. They moved in slow, deliberate lines, turning and pausing in unison, forming something like a crooked rectangle. She blinked, and they were gone. The wash lay bare again. Clay's flashlight, the only visible beam, swept over the spot. "You see that?" she asked him over the radio. "See what?" he replied, voice echoing slightly from below. "Thought I saw some light movement," she said. "Negative," he answered after a beat. "Just trash and faded tags. No kids. I think the caller was hearing traffic noise and letting their imagination fill in the rest." Back in the car, Leah couldn't stop replaying that blink of light. She knew how her mind worked. She'd processed enough blood stains and shadowy corners to be familiar with the brain's tendency to make patterns out of nothing. But this hadn't felt like that. The points had moved with intent. Later that night, after they'd cleared a burglary and a noise complaint, she asked Clay if they could circle back past the wash for kicks. He laughed and indulged her. When they crossed the bridge again around 1 a.m., the concrete below was a simple gray strip. No lights. Nothing to justify the itch between her shoulder blades. The second call came 3 nights later. Different caller, different bridge, same vague description. A bunch of little lights down in the wash, moving like they're spelling something. This time, Leah wasn't riding with Clay. She was back at the lab, processing prints from a home invasion, when she heard the radio traffic through the open door of the break room. The officer dispatched, an older guy named Jensen, reported the same thing Clay had. No one on scene, nothing unusual, area clear. Leah let it slide, told herself it was probably a group of urban explorers with headlamps who knew how to scatter fast when they heard sirens. The case that snapped it into focus was a homicide. A week after the second call, a woman was found in an abandoned lot off Roosevelt, shot once, execution style, dumped in the dirt like garbage. Leah was there as the sun came up, zoning the scene, marking casings, photographing the drag marks where someone had pulled the body from a car. It was ugly but familiar. The city was full of ugly. Back at the lab, she started the tedious work of downloading and cataloging every camera that might have caught something near the scene. One of those was a traffic camera mounted on the bridge that crossed the wash a few blocks away. It wasn't pointed directly at the lot, but it did capture the wash beneath and the glow from the overpasses around midnight the night before the body was discovered. She scrubbed through hours of nothing, empty concrete, the occasional transient walking through. A stray car's headlights slicing across the underside of the bridge. Then, at 11:47 p.m., something flickered on the far side of the frame. Little points of light, faint on the grainy feed, moving in lines across the wash floor. Leah leaned closer. They weren't headlights. They were too low, too steady, too numerous. It looked like a cluster of flashlights, dozens of them. But there were no visible bodies holding them. The lights slid into place, forming a rough rectangle with a wider spot at one end. Leah's stomach turned as she recognized the shape. It was the outline she'd just marked out in the abandoned lot that morning. The rectangle of disturbed dirt where the body had lain, the wider patch where blood had soaked the ground. She grabbed a screenshot, printed it, and overlaid it on a scaled sketch of the homicide scene. The proportions matched eerily well. She told herself it was coincidence. She also knew she wouldn't be able to sleep if she didn't at least mention it. She brought it to her supervisor, a tired man who'd seen too many weird things to get rattled easily. He stared at the overlay for a long moment. "It's probably kids," he said finally, but his voice wasn't quite certain. "Messing around, maybe tracing chalk outlines down there. The wash runs near half our scenes. You start mapping it to everything, you'll see it everywhere." He set the paper aside. "Nice catch, though. Good eye." He didn't tell her not to look into it. He also didn't offer resources to help. So she did what people in her position always did. She used her own time. Between cases, she pulled whatever footage she could from traffic cameras overlooking the wash. Most of it was nothing, but in clip after clip, late at night, around the same window of time, the lights appeared. Sometimes they moved in straight lines, sometimes in strange, almost organic patterns. On 3 different nights, they formed shapes that matched layouts from cases she'd worked. An apartment living room where a double stabbing had happened. A crossroads where a hit-and-run victim had died. An alley where a homeless man had been set on fire. What made it worse was that some of the patterns didn't match any open case, at least not yet. They were shapes with no file to attach to, no victim she recognized. One in particular kept drawing her eye, a cluster of points converging under an overpass far from any known hotspot, forming a kind of spiral with a gap at one edge. She printed that one too, circled the location, shoved it into a folder in her desk. She told herself she was just cataloging curiosities. It stopped feeling like a curiosity the night she saw the lights with her own eyes again. She wasn't on a ride-along this time. She was driving home in her own car, windows down, the smell of hot dust in the air. She took the long way, habit now, glancing down into the wash whenever she crossed it. On one bridge, near that spiral location she'd circled, she saw them. Faint, pale dots moving across the concrete like slow meteors. She pulled over on the far side, heart kicking up, and parked illegally by the guardrail. The wash was closer to the surface here, no tall fences, just a short drop. She leaned on the rail and watched. The lights were brighter in person than on camera. They weren't beams, exactly, more like points, as if the concrete itself were emitting a weak glow in spots. They moved in lines that intersected, paused, then split, like people walking predictable routes. Except there were no people, no shadows, no movement in the air above the lights. Leah held her breath and tried to map the pattern to something familiar. It was big, maybe the size of a house footprint. A central mass, linear offshoots, rooms, hallways. Her fingers twitched with the urge to sketch it out. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights winked out. The wash lay blank again. Traffic hissed behind her, unaware. She didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. 2 weeks later, there was a call out before dawn. Shots fired near a motel that backed up to that same stretch of wash, reports of multiple victims. When Leah stepped under the crime scene tape, the pattern hit her like a slap. The adjoining rooms, the tight hallway, the way the shell casings and bodies lay. She'd seen it before, traced in little floating points of light on bare concrete. The spiral formation from her printed image matched the tangled paths of people running and falling in panic. Her stomach turned. She could have drawn the scene before she arrived. She told no one. At least, not at first. Who do you tell, in a job already drowning in coincidence and horror, that you think the ground under your city is sketching crime scenes before they happen? But it changed the way she looked at the wash. She started asking officers on graveyard shift if they'd ever seen anything weird down there. Most shrugged. A few smirked and told old stories about ghost flashlights or kids with drones. One older cop, a woman only a few years from retirement, gave her a long, careful look. "You been watching the late-night cams?" she asked. Leah nodded slowly. The woman sipped her coffee. "My advice. You didn't see anything. Let the wash keep its secrets. Otherwise, you'll start thinking you're supposed to stop whatever it's showing you. That way lies madness, kid." Leah didn't stop watching. She told herself she just wanted data. She set an alarm on nights she wasn't on call, woke up around the time the lights tended to appear, logged into feeds she technically wasn't supposed to access from home. Sometimes the wash was empty. Sometimes the lights danced in patterns she recognized from old cases that had already happened, as if replaying them. And sometimes they drew something new. Those nights were the worst. She'd screenshot, print, draw, trying to figure out where, exactly, in the grid of the city that shape would fit. Once, she took one of those prints to a lieutenant she trusted and laid it on his desk, alongside the layout of an open missing persons case. "If anything ever goes down that looks like this," she said quietly, "we might want to get there faster than usual." He stared at the papers, then at her. "You okay?" he asked. She forced a smile and lied. The last time she went down into the wash herself, it was because she saw something she couldn't pretend away. On a late shift, reviewing footage, she saw lights moving that weren't generic shapes. They seemed to mimic two flashlight beams, sweeping, intersecting, splitting up. They followed paths she recognized. Down the access ramp, across the bed, under the bridge. It looked, unnervingly, like the movements of two officers searching. Her officers. Their path ended at a dark spot beneath the bridge, where shadows pooled. There, the lights converged into a dense little cluster, then flickered violently and went out. Leah replayed it 3 times, heart thudding harder each time. She checked the patrol roster. 2 units were assigned to that sector. Both cars were out on other calls. No one was scheduled to check the wash. It was like watching a future incident with no entry in the CAD yet. She grabbed her keys and her unofficial concern and went. The lot by the access ramp was empty when she arrived. The city noise felt muted, like someone had thrown a blanket over it. She climbed down, flashlight in hand, feeling the coolness of the concrete through her boots. Down in the channel. The world narrowed to high walls and a strip of sky. The underpass ahead was a rectangular mouth of darkness. Her beam cut into it, showed tags, old mattresses, the usual. No lights, no officers, no cluster of glowing points. She stood in the center of that shadow, swallowed by the smell of damp concrete and urine, and realized how quiet it was. No traffic vibration, no distant sirens, just the echo of her own breath. For a moment, she had the dizzying sensation that she was the one moving along a path the wash had already traced, that somewhere, from some higher vantage point, a cluster of pale dots was sliding her way under a bridge, forming the outline of a woman with a flashlight who had gone somewhere she shouldn't alone. She got back in her car, locked the doors, and sat there until her hands stopped shaking. She did not log what she'd seen. She could have filed a report about unknown persons with lights in the wash, about possible pre-incident mapping. She didn't. Instead, she tucked the newest printout into her folder with the others and told herself, again, that she was only collecting curiosities. A month later, a rookie and his training officer chased a suspect down into that same stretch. The suspect got away. The rookie broke his ankle in a shallow hole, exactly where the intense cluster of lights had formed in her video. It could have been just bad luck. The instructor said, "Watch where you're stepping next time." Leah stared at the X-ray on the medic's tablet and wondered if there even was a next time, or if they were all just walking the same routes drawn in the wash, over and over. Years from now, no one will remember the exact call numbers or the names on the reports. They'll remember maybe some half-joking story about strange lights in the flood channels, something told to creeped-out rookies on their first night shift. What they won't see are the maps in a box in one crime scene tech's closet, layers of lines and points tracing the city's underbelly, some matching scenes that made the news, some that never did, some that still haven't happened yet. Because if there's one thing Leah learned on those long nights staring down into the concrete river, it's that not all hauntings involve ghosts. Sometimes it's the ground itself, lighting up where the worst things will happen, whether anyone is watching or not. For most people, police radio is just background noise, bursts of static, and numbers that bleed together. For a graveyard sergeant, it's a heartbeat. You learn the rhythm of it. You know which dispatcher does that little upward lilt at the end of sentences, which officer clears his throat before every transmission, which parts of the city are so quiet between 2 and 4 a.m. that any unexpected click makes you sit up. That was why, when Channel 7 lit up at 3:09 a.m., with a voice that wasn't supposed to exist, Sergeant Nolan knew instantly that something was wrong. Channel 7 was dead. Had been for years. It was physically locked out on the consoles, a relic from when the department reorganized its frequencies. There shouldn't have been anything on it but silence. He was sitting in the radio room that first night, a place he'd made his second home. Most supervisors let dispatch handle the net and only chimed in when something big happened. Nolan liked to be there in the dim glow of consoles and screens, tracking little unit numbers as they moved across the map. The city outside pulsed with its own weird life, sirens, bar fights, late-night traffic. But in that room, it all filtered into voices and codes he could manage. After losing a partner a decade back on a call that went sideways, he'd gotten into the habit of knowing exactly where everyone was, all the time. It gave him the illusion that he could keep bad things from sneaking up on his people. It was a slow night, the kind that made you suspicious. A couple of drunk drivers, one domestic that cleared without a report, an alarm that turned out to be a shop owner closing up late. Dispatchers were chatting quietly between calls. The digital clock on the wall rolled from 3:08 to 3:09. That was when the dead channel's indicator flicked green. A soft click came through the speaker, the kind that precedes someone keying up. Nolan's eyes went to the display automatically. For Channel 7, the unit ID field should have been blank. Instead, a string of numbers and letters appeared, format correct, but not matching any active radio in their fleet. Then a male voice, calm and flat, spoke into the room. 1033. The voice said, "Officer needs help. 27th Avenue and Indian School." The tone was all wrong for that code. 1033 is the one you yell, or scream, or spit through clenched teeth. This sounded like someone reading from a list, reciting the worst sentence in the book the way you'd read a grocery item. Nolan felt the tiny hairs on his arm stand up. One of the dispatchers, Hannah, frowned and tapped at her console. "Dispatch to unit calling 1033 on 7, she said, professional. "Repeat your unit number and location." No response. The green light for Channel 7 went dark. On the big CAD screen, there were no units near 27th and Indian School. Nothing on any active channel about an officer needs help. Hannah glanced over at Nolan. He shook his head once, trying to convince himself this was a misky, a test pattern, anything other than what it felt like. He sent a nearby patrol car to roll through the intersection anyway. Routine welfare check, he told himself. The officer came back 5 minutes later, voice casual. "Sarge, intersection's clear. Corner stores closed, no vehicles, no pedestrians. Looks like a ghost town." Nolan made him do a full lap of the surrounding blocks just to be sure. Nothing. When he came back to the radio room, Hannah was still staring at her console. "7's not mapped to anything," she said. "It's dark on the board. You saw that, right?" He had. He told her not to worry about it, to chalk it up to some glitch in the back end. That was the easiest lie. 3 nights later, at exactly 3:09 a.m., Channel 7 lit up again. Same click, same unassigned unit ID, same voice, same flat tone. 1016 domestic disturbance, 1243 West Polk, it said. Female screaming, line disconnected. This time, Nolan already had a pad and pen in hand. He wrote it down, even as Hannah responded on instinct. "Unit calling on 7, repeat. You're on an inactive channel. Say again your identifier." Silence. The channel died. Nolan punched the address into CAD. Nothing current. But when he searched the historical file, the hair on his neck rose. 11 years ago to the day they'd had a call at that exact address. Domestic turned murder-suicide. Man shot his wife and then himself before the first units arrived. The timestamp on the old call. 3:09 a.m. He didn't tell the room that detail. He dispatched a car anyway, made them knock on the door of the duplex at 1243 West Polk. A confused college kid answered, half asleep, no idea what they were talking about. No disturbance, no screaming. Nolan cleared the call as unfounded and went back to his chair, where the note he'd just scribbled sat next to a printout of the 11-year-old CAD entry. Same time, same address, same call type. Different outcome because this time there was nothing to respond to. Or maybe the outcome had already happened, long ago, and whatever was talking on Channel 7 didn't know that. Over the next month, the dead channel came alive every few nights. Always at 3:09. Always a different location. Always severe. Officer down, child abduction, shots fired, structure fire with entrapment. The voice never changed. It didn't sound like any of his current people, or like any dispatcher. It sounded like an automated system given terrible news to read. The unit ID on the console remained in that same nonsense format. There was never a reply when Hannah or any other dispatcher tried to get more. Nolan started a separate log, handwritten, tucked into a manila folder he kept in a locked drawer. Date, time, call code, address. Next to some of them, he was able to write, in smaller letters, matches closed case, see XYZ incident. Others, the majority, he left blank. He wasn't sure which ones were echoes and which were something else. The first time one of the calls matched a future incident, or seemed to, was when the voice read out, 1050 major, vehicle versus pedestrian 7th Street in Dunlap, multiple injuries. That night, when he pulled up the map, the intersection was dead. No units, no calls. He considered sending a car. It was 3 a.m. Traffic would be light. If this was some pattern, some weird bleed-through from a past wreck, there was no rational reason to treat it as predictive. He still almost keyed up. Before he could, an officer on an actual live channel requested a status check on a prolonged traffic stop on the other side of the city. Nolan answered. His attention pulled in 2 directions like it always was. By the time he looked back at the 7th and Dunlap grid square, it was empty again. 2 days later, during rush hour, a drunk driver blew a red light at 7th and Dunlap and plowed into a crosswalk full of people heading to the light rail. 3 dead at the scene, 2 more in surgery by the evening. The 10 code attached to the first radio call from that intersection was, of course, 10-50 major, multiple injuries. The timestamp was 5:42 p.m., nowhere near 3:09. And yet when Nolan heard the recording played on the news, something in the wording matched what the flat voice on Channel 7 had said. It was as if whatever haunted that dead frequency had read the script early, but got the cue wrong. He started sleeping less. He'd go home, lay down for 2 hours, wake up at 2:45 with his heart already beating hard, like his body knew it was almost time. More nights than not, he found his way back to the radio room, sitting in the dark behind the console operators, eyes fixed on the dead channel's indicator. Not every night brought a transmission. When it did, he logged it. 1071, shots fired, officer hit, 19th Avenue and Bethany home. That one matched an officer-involved shooting from 6 years ago. The officer survived back then. The suspect hadn't. 1089 bomb threat courthouse credible. That one, thank God, never materialized. At least, not that week. He started to see the pattern and the lack of pattern at the same time. Some calls seemed to be reruns of the worst days in the department's history, sliced and fed back through a ghost channel. Others seemed to dangle out in front of him like a dare. People noticed he was different, of course. Hannah caught him staring at the dead channel's light more than once. "Sarge," she said one night when he flinched at a random static pop, "are we going to talk about the fact that 7 keeps coming on by itself?" He should have shut it down. Should have said it was being handled by IT. Instead, he told her the partial truth. "There's some anomalous traffic," he said. "Old recordings bouncing around. Nothing you need to worry about. Just log it as interference and move on." She raised an eyebrow. "Except you haven't moved on," she said. "You sit here every night at 3:09 like it's a show." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't give one. The worst transmission came on a night when he'd promised himself he was going to stay out of the radio room. He was in his office, going over use of force reports, when an officer down the hall yelled his name. "Sarge, you might want to hear this," he shouted. Nolan was halfway out of his chair before he realized the time. 3:09. He hurried in as Channel 7's light glowed an eerie green. The voice, calm as ever, said, "1033. Officer needs help. 1842 West Monroe. Unit calling is..." There was a brief burst of static, like someone dragging a hand across sandpaper, and then it read a call sign. His call sign from years back, when he'd still been in a patrol car. The room went dead quiet. Every dispatcher turned to look at him. "Dispatch to unit identifying as..." Hannah repeated the number, trying to keep professional. "We're not reading you on any active channel. Return to your primary." Nothing. Channel 7 clicked off. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of electronics. Nolan's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. He knew that address. 1842. West Monroe was a duplex where, 9 years ago, he and his partner had gone on what should have been a simple warrant service. It turned into the night his partner died. They'd gone in wrong, been ambushed in the hallway. Shots fired, bodies dropped. His partner bled out on the floor while Nolan tried and failed to keep him here. His own radio had been shot to pieces in the first volley. He never managed to call a 1033. To this day, one of the things that kept him up was wondering if, had he gotten that code out faster, the responding backup could have made the difference. Now, a voice on a dead channel had just transmitted the call he never got to make. The date on the whiteboard was 2 days shy of that incident's anniversary. When he pulled the old records later, he saw something that made his head swim. The original CAD entry for that night, the one where other units finally called out shots fired at that address, showed an odd timestamp glitch. A phantom 1033 from his unit, logged at 3:09 a.m., then immediately overwritten as an error. No audio attached, just a ghost entry. For years, IT had written it off as some misky during the chaos. Now it looked like that ghost had found a voice. From then on, the dead channel wasn't just creepy, it felt personal. Nolan found himself treating each 3:09 transmission like a test. If it mirrored a past incident, he'd dig up the file after shift and read it, looking for some angle he'd missed. If it didn't match anything he recognized, he'd consider quietly staging units near the locations mentioned, just in case. He never made it official. No memo went out saying, "Hey, the haunted channel says something bad might happen at this corner, be ready." He knew how that would sound. But once, when the voice read, 1071, shots fired, multiple victims, 32nd Street and Thomas, and his logs didn't show any prior big incidents there. He happened to suggest to a patrol lieutenant that maybe they beef up presence around that intersection for a week. "Visibility," he said. "Community engagement." The lieutenant shrugged and agreed. Nothing happened at 32nd and Thomas that week. A month later, 2 blocks away, there was a drive-by that left 3 teenagers dead. The more he listened, the more he realized he was caught in a trap with no good choices. If he ignored the dead channel entirely, he'd always wonder which calls might have been warnings, which lives might have been saved. If he treated them all as gospel, he'd tie up half the city's resources chasing ghosts, leaving other real calls unanswered. And always, under everything, was the sick possibility that he was just listening to scrambled radio from some other time, some other place, that had nothing to do with him or his officers at all. The night that broke him, just a little, came without any dramatic incident attached. At 3:09 a.m., Channel 7 lit up and the now familiar voice said, 1054, unattended death, 4BU32 West Mojave. Elderly male, no signs of foul play. It was the most benign call yet. Nolan checked the address. It didn't ping anything in his memory. No prior big case, no existing open call. He wrote it down anyway. An unattended death. Someone's grandfather, most likely found by a neighbor or a home health aide in the morning. On the list of horror the channel had been feeding him, it was almost kind. A week later, he was at his own kitchen table, paying bills, when his chest tightened hard and threw him to the floor. The paramedics, who eventually broke down his door, logged the call as an unattended death at 4E132 West Mojave, the address he'd moved into 7 years earlier, needing distance from his partner's ghost and choosing a quiet street on the west side without thinking much about it. He didn't die. Not that time. The medics restarted a heart that had decided it had had enough of caffeine and stress and midnight ghosts. He woke up in a hospital bed to hear a young doctor explaining how lucky he was they'd gotten there when they did, how he'd better take it easy. Nolan listened, and all he could think about was the way Channel 7 had calmly read out his own unattended death a week in advance, as if the future was just another entry in a log it had access to, and he didn't. When he eventually went back to work, everyone told him to slow down, to stop hovering over the radio, to let the city's chaos be someone else's problem for a while. He nodded, smiled, pretended to agree. But on his first night shift back, at 3:05 a.m., he found himself standing in the doorway of the radio room again, watching the dead channel's light. When it stayed dark at 3:09, he felt both relief and something like disappointment. The dispatcher on duty glanced at him. "Sarge," she said hesitantly, "you ever wonder if those are really warnings?" He thought about his partner, about the crash at 7th and Dunlap, about the quiet line that had read his home address. "I think they're proof," he said slowly, "that somewhere, some version of us is always calling for help. Whether anyone can actually answer, that's another story." He never did figure out where the transmissions came from. It ran diagnostics. Manufacturers swore up and down that the channel was physically disabled. Some tech suggested maybe a distant department was accidentally stepping on their frequencies. None of it explained why the addresses matched their city, or why the time was always 3:09, or why his old call sign had spoken up that one night. The dead channel kept its secrets. The folder in his drawer got thicker. And if you asked him, years later, what scared him most about those early morning calls, it wasn't the idea that he was hearing the past, or even the possibility he was hearing the future. It was the notion that the job had always been like this: officers bleeding out in hallways, victims screaming for help, cars crashing through intersections, and that somewhere, buried in the noise, there had always been a frequency quietly keeping score, reading out every worst-case scenario in a calm, flat voice, long before any of it showed up on the evening news. Every station has a room people pretend not to notice. In some places it's a back closet, in others an old locker bay or a half-finished office. At the Prescott substation off Gurley Street, it was a windowless storage room at the end of the downstairs hallway past the old holding cells and the evidence freezer that never quite kept a stable temperature. Officially, it was marked on the floor plan as Records Overflow. Unofficially, it was the room the veterans told rookies not to go into alone after midnight. They never said it was haunted. Cops don't like that word. They just said, if you're pulling boxes from 12B, make sure someone's in earshot, and don't shut the door all the way. When Officer Aaron Pike first transferred up from Phoenix, he assumed the talk about the room was the usual hazing. Small-town guys testing the nerves of city kids. He'd heard more dramatic ghost stories in academy dorms. Still, the first time his FTO walked him past the door at the end of the hall, a heavy institutional slab with a metal push bar and no window, the older man paused just long enough to tap the frame with his knuckles. "That's the room we don't search," he said. No flourish, no wink. Then he kept walking. The phrase stuck with Aaron all week. The room we don't search. Every other space in the building had been walked, cleared, cataloged. That one, apparently, had earned an exception. The hallway that led to it felt different at night. During the day, light from upstairs bled down the stairwell. Voices bounced against cinder block. Lockers slammed, phones rang. After midnight, when patrol trickled in and out and the front lobby went dark, the basement took on its own separate atmosphere. The air felt heavier, carrying the smells of old coffee, dust, and bleach that had soaked into porous walls over decades. The door to records overflow sat at the very end, a scuffed rectangle in a stretch of painted cinder block. A little brass plate above the knob read 12B. Sometimes, when Aaron walked past it on his way to the holding cells, he thought he felt a faint draft coming from under the door, as if the room were breathing in a slow, shallow way. He teased the older guys about it at first. "What's in there anyway?" he asked one night in the squad room, flipping through a stack of warrants. Old mugshots, dust bunnies, Jimmy Hoffa. The sergeant, a compact man named Ralston with 25 years on, didn't smile. "Old cases," he said. "Old mistakes. Stuff that doesn't play nice with the new evidence system." He took a sip of coffee. "You'll go in there eventually. Everyone does once. Just remember, you don't have to stay long." The way he said it wiped the grin off Aaron's face. The opportunity came on a slow graveyard shift a few weeks later. He'd cleared his last call early, and the phone at the front desk had been quiet for an hour. Ralston looked around the squad room at his 3 officers and said, "We're behind on box audits. Somebody want to earn brownie points with records. Room 12B, shelf list, is on the clipboard by the door." The 2 veterans suddenly found urgent paperwork to complete. Aaron, being new and still eager, shrugged. "I'll do it," he said. "How bad can it be?" One of the older officers, a woman named Green, opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then thought better of it. "Take your radio," she said instead, "and prop the door." The clipboard hung on a hook beside 12B, a thin layer of dust on the top sheet. The audit list was simple. Check off file numbers on boxes. Make sure they were present and in order. Nothing mystical. Aaron used a rubber doorstop to wedge the door open, just to keep Green from chirping him about not listening. The hinges squealed as the heavy door swung inward. Cool air spilled out, carrying that dense, papery smell of old cardboard and aging files. He flicked on the light switch, expecting a harsh fluorescence buzz. The fixture overhead hummed, but the light it produced felt dimmer than it should have, like it only illuminated the first few feet and gave up on the corners. Shelves lined 3 walls, metal uprights sagging slightly under the weight of decades of boxed case files, labeled in thick black marker. The labels were in an old hand, predating the current computerized inventory system. Homicide, 1998-99. Unsolved miss, EVD. Hold, internal. Aaron stepped inside, let his eyes adjust, and felt the door behind him push gently against the rubber wedge, as if it wanted to close. He ignored the sensation and started with the closest shelf, checking off numbers on the clipboard. For the first couple of minutes, it was as boring as he'd expected. Box, label, number. Box, label, number. He didn't notice the air changing until he stopped to shift the weight from one foot to the other and realized he couldn't hear the faint rumble of the HVAC anymore. The outside noise, the muffled thumps, and distant voices of the rest of the station had faded too. It was as if the room had pulled a thick layer of cotton around itself. He moved deeper between the shelves. The farther he went, the older the labels looked. Handwriting neat at first, then more hurried, dates drifting back toward the 80s and 70s. One box on a low shelf had no printed label at all, just a strip of masking tape across the front with a single word, written in a tight, angry scrawl, "Do not destroy." There was no case number, no date, just that instruction. Aaron felt a stupid urge to open it, to see what someone had cared enough to save that emphatically. He set the clipboard down and pulled the box out a few inches. The cardboard rasped against metal. As he did, another box on the shelf above shifted on its own, sliding toward the edge until it thumped against his shoulder. He flinched and let go. "Careful," a voice said behind him. "Those fall, you'll be swimming in ghosts." Aaron spun, heart thudding. The aisle behind him was empty. His radio hissed softly on his belt. No active traffic. For a second he thought he'd imagined it, a leftover echo of Green or Ralston in his head. Then he saw the door. The rubber wedge lay on its side on the floor, useless. The door itself was firmly shut. He was alone in a sealed room with a single, not very bright fluorescent and rows of boxes labeled Unsolved. His scalp prickled. He walked to the door, hand outstretched. The metal felt cooler than the air around it. He pushed the bar. It gave easily. On the other side, the hallway glowed with the normal amber of night shift lights. The sounds rushed back in, the distant ring of a phone, a printer chattering upstairs. He stood there for a moment with the door half open, then made what he would later call his mistake. He told himself he didn't want to look like a coward if someone walked by and saw him working with the door wide open. He told himself that shutting it would keep the noise out and let him concentrate. Mostly, he didn't like the idea that a room needed to be treated like it was dangerous. So he pulled the wedge back into the room, let the door close gently until it latched with a soft click, and went back to the shelves. The quiet folded around him again, like a weighted blanket. The next odd thing he noticed was that some of the boxes weren't where the inventory said they should be. The list on his clipboard showed an entry for Box 12 for 2337, missing juvenile 2003, on the second shelf, third from the right. When he counted down and across, the box in that spot was labeled 12201, suicidal 1995. He checked again. The neighboring boxes' numbers didn't line up either. It was like someone had come in and shuffled things around according to some other system. He made a mark on the list, intending to flag it for records. As he moved down the aisle, a label caught his eye. 12713, Runaway 2010. Under it, smaller, someone had written a girl's first name. He knew that name. Every cop in the county did. It belonged to a teenager who'd gone missing off a bus stop and was never found. Her photo still hung on a bulletin board by the break room, curled at the edges from years of sunlight. He stared at the box, at the handwritten note. Technically, all that case's paperwork should have been scanned into the digital system years ago, the physical file either archived offsite or destroyed. Why was this still here, in a room everyone pretended not to use? He slid the box out. The cardboard was cold, as if it had been sitting in a refrigerator. Inside were carefully organized files, photographs, DVD-Rs in paper sleeves, a worn spiral notebook. On top of the stack lay a Polaroid. The girl from the bulletin board smiled stiffly at the camera, standing in front of what looked like a movie theater. Behind her, half out of frame, a man in a sheriff's uniform was visible, just his side, the curve of his jaw, the edge of his badge. The hair on Aaron's arms rose. The face was angled away, but the profile looked uncomfortably like his sergeant, younger, with less gray at the temples. He turned the Polaroid over. On the back, in blue ink, someone had written the date and a location. The address wasn't the bus stop where she'd last been seen. It was the station's old address, before they'd moved into their current building. The little note made his stomach flip. Why would a missing girl be at the station for a photo op with a deputy before she disappeared? Why wasn't this image in the official case file he'd seen during training? He swallowed and looked back into the box. The spiral notebook on top wasn't departmental issue. It was the kind of thing a detective might carry. The first page he flipped to had scrawled notes about leads that went nowhere, calls not returned, tips dismissed. In the margins, in smaller handwriting, someone had written, "Told to drop this. Not enough evidence. Watch your back." The hum of the fluorescent deepened for a moment, flickered. The light dimmed, and then came back. When it did, the air felt heavier again. He became aware of a faint sound under the electrical buzz, whispering. Not clear words, just the cadence of hushed voices, overlapping, like two people talking in the next room with the door nearly shut. He instinctively held his breath to listen. The whispers seemed to come from deeper in the shelves, from the far corner where the boxes were older, labels yellowed. Every rational part of his mind told him it was the building settling, the refrigeration unit cycling, distant voices from upstairs bending through ducts. The rest of him thought about the instruction on that masking tape. Do not destroy. His radio crackled, making him jump. Pike, status, Ralston's voice. Aaron exhaled. Pike in 12B, he replied, forcing his tone light. Still breathing. Couple shelves left. Ralston chuckled. Don't let the paperwork swallow you. We'll send a rescue team if you go quiet. The radio clicked off. The whispers didn't. They seemed, if anything, more distinct now that he'd acknowledged the room. He told himself to finish the audit and get out, but his eyes kept drifting to the boxes labeled Evide, Hold, Internal, and UNFND, Susp. One in particular had a faint ring on its lid, like someone had set a coffee mug there and left a circular stain. The label was half peeled, the handwriting underneath faded. When he squinted, he could just make out the words, Use of Force, Review. His hand moved toward that box without permission. Fingers slid under the lid. As he lifted it, something inside shifted with a soft rustle. Not quite paper. The light overhead dimmed again, dropping the room into a murky twilight where the corners seemed to pulse. In that instant between light and dark, Aaron thought he saw figures squeezed between the shelves, suggestions of shoulders, the glint of badge pins, faces turned just enough that he couldn't make them out. The whispers rose to a murmur. He froze, heart pounding against the inside of his ribs. Close that, a voice said, right next to his ear. It was Ralston's voice, but there was no one behind him. Some things you don't want to see if you plan on staying here. His hand snapped the lid shut. The whispers dropped back to a susurrus. The fluorescence steadied. He stood there shaking, looking at the neat rows of boxes that moments ago had seemed to hold more than paper. When he finally forced himself to move, he put the notebook and Polaroid back in the runaway girl's file, slid the box onto the shelf, and grabbed his clipboard. He did not check the rest of the numbers. The audit would have to remain incomplete. At the door, his hand on the bar, he couldn't resist one glance back. The room looked ordinary again. Boxes, shelves, one flickering light. But as he watched, a cardboard box on the far left, on a shelf he knew he hadn't touched, slid forward an inch on its own, as if nudged from behind. The label faced outward. Even at that distance, he could read the name scrawled above the case number. His own. Pike. Always Review. His stomach dropped. He hadn't been involved in any officer-involved shooting. Not yet. The case number under his name was one he didn't recognize, part of a series that looked like dates a few years ahead. He shoved the door open and stepped into the hallway, lungs suddenly desperate for the stale basement air. The noise of the station flooded back, washing over him with almost physical relief. Ralston was coming down the stairs, coffee mug in hand. His eyes flicked to the door, to Aaron's face. You went and closed it, didn't you? He said. Not angry, just resigned. Aaron swallowed. There's boxes in there with stuff that's not in the system, he said, words tumbling out. Cases that look like they were buried, and one with my name on it. Ralston took a slow breath, set his mug on the nearest flat surface. Everybody's got a box in there, he said quietly. Some are labeled, some aren't yet. That's why we tell you don't stay long. The longer you look, the more the room shows you. He clapped a hand on Aaron's shoulder and steered him toward the stairs. Officially, it's where records dumps overflow that doesn't scan right, he said, his voice reverting to a more normal tone. Unofficially, it's where the department stores the stuff it doesn't want to admit is still open. Cases that should have been solved but weren't. Complaints that should have gone to IA but got lost. Every now and then, someone goes digging and pulls something out. Sometimes it leads to justice. Sometimes it leads to a resignation. Once or twice, it led to a funeral. He squeezed Aaron's shoulder. You want to be a hero, you knock yourself out. Just understand the cost. Back in the squad room, under brighter lights, with the scanner humming and the coffee burning, and Green joking about late-night TV, the whole experience in 12B felt like a dream that was already fading. Aaron went through the motions of finishing his shift. He told himself stress and lack of sleep, and the station's reputation had gotten into his head. He told himself he hadn't really seen his own name on a future box, that his brain had filled in the letters it expected. But later, changing in the locker room, he found a single sheet of paper folded in the bottom of his locker. No one admitted to putting it there. It was a photocopy of a Polaroid. A young patrol officer in the Prescott uniform, back to the camera, standing at the end of the hallway outside 12B, hand on the door. Under it, in faint handwriting, someone had written, "Some rooms open both ways." He never went back into records overflow alone. He still walked past the door every shift. The phrase, "the room we don't search," echoing in his head. He still wondered how many secrets were stacked in there. How many careers, how many victims' faces pressed between manila folders. On bad nights when the radio went quiet and his mind started replaying calls, he thought about that box with his name and a case number that hadn't happened yet. Was it a warning or a promise? A possibility or a fixed point waiting for him? In a job built on reports and evidence and what can be proven, the idea that a room could hold things that hadn't occurred yet should have been ridiculous. But in the basement of that old station, among decades of unsorted guilt, it didn't feel ridiculous at all. It felt like there were some investigations the building itself was holding on to, waiting for the right person, or the wrong one, to crack the lid and let them out. Oak Ridge Road didn't show up in any tourist guides, but everyone in that mountain county knew its reputation. In daylight, it was just another winding two-lane cutting through ponderosa pines, a shortcut locals used to shave 10 minutes off the drive between town and the lake. At night, especially in fog or snow, it turned into something else. Deputies called it the last turn like it was a proper noun, a place where the world narrowed down to headlights and guardrail, in the sense that if you misjudged by an inch, there would be nothing to catch you but tree trunks and empty air. They joked about it the way cops always joke about things that scare them. Dark humor, half-truths. "Don't take Oak Ridge on your last day," they'd say, "unless you want your retirement party up there." Deputy Tom Carver had spent more nights than he could count on that road. 30 years with the county, most of them on graveyard, had etched its curves into his muscles. He could feel each bend before he saw it, knew where the deer liked to stand, where icy patches lingered in shadow, where bored teenagers liked to park and drink warm beer. He also knew the stories. The stalled car that never seemed to get towed, the GPS hiccups, the officers who swore the distance between mile markers stretched at night, like the road didn't want to let you off. By the time he hit his last week before retirement, he carried those stories the way he carried old injuries, aches he'd learned to live with. It was snowing lightly the night dispatch sent him up Oak Ridge for the final time. Big town down the hill got the headlines. Their little mountain city got the drunk hunters, lost hikers, and occasional cabin burglary. The earlier calls that shift had been mundane. Noise complaint, welfare check on an older guy who'd forgotten to charge his phone, a minor fender bender in the Safeway lot. Around 2 a.m., when the bars closed and the traffic died down, he was half hoping for a quiet ride through town, maybe a chance to park somewhere dark and sip the last of his thermos in peace. The radio had other plans. "County 5, check a possible stranded motorist," the dispatcher said. Oak Ridge Road just past mile marker 14. Caller reports a vehicle pulled to the side with hazards on for the last 30 minutes. No answer when he stopped to see if they needed help. Tom sighed and keyed up. County 5 en route Oak Ridge, he said. Advise road conditions up there. Dot reports light accumulation, no plows yet, dispatch replied. Her voice held that faint note of apology he recognized from years of bad weather calls. Watch the hairpins. He smiled despite himself. Always do, he said. He turned onto Oak Ridge, his tires humming from dry pavement to that muted hiss you get on thin snow. The trees closed in immediately, dark trunks marching up into darkness. His headlights carved out a tunnel barely wider than the lane. The first few curves were familiar enough that he could almost smell the specific damp moss on each one. His GPS, mounted on the dash more from habit than need, showed the thin gray line of Oak Ridge as it snaked along. His unit icon crept forward. Mile marker 10 slid past, then 11. His high beams cut through flakes that looked like insects swarming the glass. The farther he went, the more the world outside the truck seemed to narrow. No other headlights, no porch lights from cabins, just snow and pines, and that constant drop to the left, invisible beyond the guardrail. At mile marker 13, his radio crackled with static for a second, then cleared. He thought he heard something under the static, his own name maybe, but it was gone before he could decide. When he passed the 14 marker, he eased off the gas and scanned ahead. According to the caller, the stalled car should be somewhere just beyond. For a minute, all he saw was the rhythmic alternation of tree trunks and reflective posts. Then, around a long, shallow bend, orange flashes appeared against the snow. Hazard lights, blinking steadily. County 5. I have eyes on the vehicle, he said. Pulled off on a narrow shoulder. Stand by. The car was an older sedan, maybe late 90s, parked tight against the guardrail. Its hazard lights ticked in an unwavering rhythm, painting the snow in brief pulses of amber. No other cars around. No footprints visible leading away from it. At least not from his angle. He parked behind it with his own lights on low and sat for a second watching. Something about the way the hazards flash bothered him. Most batteries left that way in the cold would have started to weaken, the rhythm slowing, the lights dimming. These blinked like the car had just been shut off. Tight, strong. He stepped out into the cold, breath puffing in front of him. The forest sounded different in snow, the usual rustle of needles replaced by a damp kind of quiet. He approached on the driver's side, hand resting lightly near his holster more from habit than fear. The windows were fogged over from the inside. He knocked on the glass. "Sheriff's office," he called. "You all right in there?" No answer. He tried the handle. To his surprise, it opened. Warm, stale air puffed out, tinged with the faint smell of exhaust and something sweeter underneath. Old perfume, maybe. The interior light didn't come on. He clicked his flashlight and shone it inside. The driver's seat was empty. So was the passenger seat. A thin layer of frost crusted the inside of the windshield, spider webbing from the corners. The keys hung in the ignition, turned halfway between off and start, like someone had killed the engine but left the power on. On the passenger seat sat an outdated registration card in a cracked plastic sleeve. The year printed on it made him frown. It had expired 15 years earlier. "County 5, vehicle appears unoccupied," he said into his radio, keeping his voice steady. "Keys in the ignition, hazards on. I'm going to run the plate." The plate was an old Arizona style he hadn't seen in years, sun-bleached at the edges. He read off the number. Dispatch was quiet longer than usual. "County 5, are you sure on that plate?" she asked finally. "Affirmative," he replied, irritation pushing through the unease. "I'm looking right at it." There was more typing on her end, audible even through the radio. "Copy, but that plate comes back to a vehicle reported totaled in a fatal MVA on Oak Ridge Road in 2001, she said slowly. "Same make and model, same color, registered owner deceased." Snowflakes settled on his jacket, tiny cold pricks. Tom looked at the car again, at the intact body. The lack of rust in places there should have been. "Copy," he said. "'Cause what else do you say to that? Send me the report number on that MVA." As he waited, he walked around the car. The trunk was closed. The rear bumper had a dent, but nothing major. The hazards kept blinking, metronome steady. He checked the ground. There should have been footprints, shoe prints leading away, boot marks, something. The snow around the car was disturbed in a vague way, but not in any pattern he could read. It looked like it had been snowing for hours over whatever tracks might have been there. Dispatch read him the old report number. He wrote it on his glove with a Sharpie, something he'd done for years when he didn't want to fumble for notebook paper in the cold. The brief from the old crash was ugly. Single vehicle roll on a winter night. Car going too fast on the last big turn before mile marker 15. Overcorrected. Went through the guardrail. Rolled down into the ravine. Driver DOA. No passengers. Poor weather a factor. He'd been working then. He vaguely remembered the call. The sight of a crumpled car half buried in snow below the road. Headlights still faintly glowing. This sedan, though, sat upright and whole at the shoulder. Hazard lights cheerfully ticking. He felt eyes on his neck. The sensation was sharp enough that he turned, shining his flashlight into the trees. The beam lit up trunks and branches, snow clinging in clumps. For a second, in the spaces between, he thought he saw a figure standing a dozen yards in. Just a darker vertical shape among vertical shapes. Shoulder and head tilted as if watching him. When he focused the light there, it was gone. Just pines. The hair on his arm stood up under his uniform. He walked back to his truck, intending to call for a tow and then get off that mountain. As he opened his door, he glanced at the GPS. The unit icon blinked on a gray line labeled Oak Ridge RRD, but the coordinates readouts were blank, just dashes. He tapped the screen. It flickered, then reset, showing his car icon briefly spinning in place before settling back exactly where it had been. Behind him, the hazards on the sedan kept pacing the clock, unwavering. He noticed then that his truck's engine sounded a little different. A faint strain, like it was idling under load. He checked the RPMs. Normal. The feeling stayed. On impulse, he pulled up the dashcam viewer and scrolled back a minute, watching the footage of himself pulling up behind the stalled car. The timestamp in the corner read 2:23 a.m. He checked his actual watch. 2:23 a.m. Something about that simultaneity made his skin crawl. He scrubbed back further, watching the headlights move along the familiar bends. When the camera view reached the point where the stalled car should appear, the road ahead was empty. No sedan, no hazard lights, just snow and pine trunks. He jumped to live view again. The car sat there, very real, hazards blinking. The dashcam timeline insisted it hadn't been there until he stepped out to walk up to it. He didn't like any of it, but he was still a cop on duty with a weird car on a dangerous road. Procedure hadn't failed him yet. "County 5, he said. "Requesting rotation tow for an abandoned vehicle on Oak Ridge. Possible old crash artifact, if you can believe that. I'll stand by until they arrive." There was a pause. "Copy County 5, dispatch said. Her voice had that thin edge weirdness put in it. "Rotation ETA is 20 out. You good up there?" He hesitated. "You don't say, 'No, the ghost car is making my teeth itch.' You say, 10-4, I'm fine." So he did. Waiting alone on Oak Ridge at 2 a.m. was not new to him. What was new was the feeling that the road itself was paying attention. The longer he stood there, the more he became aware of repetition that didn't quite line up. The pattern of hazard flashes. The way the wind gusted through the trees every 3 or 4 seconds. The squeak his boots made when he shifted his weight. It all started to sync, like a looped recording. He found his mind slipping back to that first fatal crash, the one in 2001. He remembered climbing down to the wreck, breath clouding in front of him, hearing the distant wail of an ambulance that would arrive too late. He remembered looking up at the guardrail, at the dark strip of road and thinking, "This is a bad place to die. A branch snapped in the woods to his right. He swung his light toward the sound. The beam caught, for a fraction of a second, the outline of a man standing just beyond the first line of trees. The man wore a sheriff's jacket, the reflective stripes picking up the light. His face was turned away, looking down into the ravine. "Hey," Tom called. "You with the tow?" The figure didn't move. Tom took a step toward the tree line. His radio crackled. "County 5. Tow is advising they're just leaving town now," dispatch said, timing off. He'd been told 20 minutes. It had been at least that already. He glanced at his watch. 2:23 a.m. He blinked. Again. He lifted it closer. The second hand ticked, but the minute hand sat on the same mark. He looked back at the trees. The man in the jacket was gone. Something cold slid down his spine that had nothing to do with the snow. He keyed his mic. "County 5 status check," he said, not sure why. "We've got you holding on Oak Ridge, 2:24 a.m., dispatch replied. Her clock had moved. His hadn't. He stared at his watch until the minute hand finally lurched forward to 2:24, as if catching up. The hazards on the sedan never missed a beat. The tow truck finally arrived by all their clocks at 2:35. Its amber bar cast a new layer of light over the scene. The driver, bundled in a heavy coat, gave Tom a skeptical look when he saw the car. "This the one from the call?" he asked. "Looks like it's been sitting a while." Tom nodded. "Old registration," he said. "Probably some weird paperwork glitch. Just get it off the road." The driver hooked it up, muttering about the grade and the slickness. When he climbed into the sedan to put it in neutral, he paused. "Huh," he said. "Keys are ice cold." Tom didn't answer. As the tow crept away, the sedan's hazard lights finally died, sputtering into darkness, as if the movement itself had broken whatever loop they'd been stuck in. On his way back down Oak Ridge, the turns felt different, longer. He counted them, like he always did. 7 big ones, 3 little ones, the last tight hairpin before the main road. He found himself adding an extra curve that hadn't been there before, a long, sweeping bend that seemed to stretch on too far, guardrail hugging his left, drop-off invisible beyond. His GPS hiccuped, showed his unit icon sliding off the gray line into blank space for a second before snapping back. He gritted his teeth, focused on the yellow center stripes, and didn't look into the trees. He had the strong, irrational sense that if he met the eyes of whatever watched from there, he wouldn't make it to the bottom. Back at the station, he pulled the old crash report. The photo of the 2001 wreck showed a mangled sedan at the bottom of a snowy slope, its hazard lights faintly visible through the crushed rear. The license plate was the same as the one he'd read that night. The time of the crash, according to the report, was 2:23 a.m. The reporting deputy's signature at the bottom made his stomach flip. It was his. He had been the one who'd found that wreck 23 years earlier, on a night so much like this one it blurred in his mind. He sat there, holding that piece of paper, and felt the weight of all the times he'd driven that road since, all the loops he might have been running without realizing it. On his last day, when well-meaning colleagues asked if he wanted to take a ceremonial final tour of his favorite spots, he smiled and said no. He'd let the younger guys handle Oak Ridge. In his quiet moments after, sitting on his porch with the coffee, he thought about the stalled car, about the man in the trees who wore his jacket, about the clock sticking at 2:23. He wondered how many times he'd already done that call. How many versions of him had walked up to that same sedan, written the same report, gone home thinking they'd escaped. He wondered if the road remembered all their tires, all their mistakes, more clearly than they did. If you drive Oak Ridge at night now, the locals might warn you about deer, about black ice, about poor cell service. They might tell you, if you catch them in the right mood, about a wreck years ago that left a scar on the guardrail that never quite rusts over. They probably won't mention the way some officers' dashcams glitch there, or how their watches sometimes stick on 1 minute a little too long, or how more than one deputy has sworn they saw their own silhouette standing at the tree line as they passed. Those details live in the same place as all the other unofficial reports. The stories traded in low voices in locker rooms, the things you don't write down if you want to keep your psych eval clean. Tom never wrote down the weird parts of that last Oak Ridge call. The paperwork shows a stranded vehicle towed, no occupants found, no further action. Clean, simple. But in the years after he turned in his badge, every time he heard a siren winding up the mountain at night, he'd find himself glancing toward the dark line of trees beyond his backyard. And sometimes, just for a moment, he'd have the unsettling feeling that a version of him was still up there, on that too long curve past mile marker 14, hazard lights pulsing in the snow, trying to decide whether to keep driving or finally follow the road where it really wanted to go.